I've been trying to pinpoint exactly when I crossed the line from doing something questionable into doing something genuinely harmful. But the truth is, there probably wasn't one single moment. It was gradual. It was a series of small compromises that seemed reasonable at the time, but added up to something I'm deeply ashamed of now. I used to write recommendation letters for people applying to jobs. Sounds innocent enough, right? Except I was writing them for strangers I'd never met, people who paid me to fabricate glowing references for positions they weren't qualified for. I'm holed up in a Premier Inn outside Newcastle now, having fled my flat in Leeds after discovering what some of those recommendations were actually being used for, because it turns out that helping unqualified people get jobs they shouldn't have isn't just unethical, it's dangerous. And I've spent the last 6 months living with the consequences of not asking enough questions about who I was helping and why they needed my services. The whole thing started about 18 months ago, when I was barely scraping by as a freelance copywriter. I'd left my job as a communications officer for a local charity after a falling out with management, and I'd discovered that freelance writing paid even worse than I'd feared. Most months, I was choosing between heating and eating, as the saying goes. I'd been doing the usual freelance work, blog posts, website copy, the occasional press release, when I came across a request on a freelance platform from someone looking for professional reference letters. They explained they were applying for jobs, but had been out of work for several years and didn't have recent references from employers who could vouch for their skills. The rate they offered was generous, £200 for a single letter that would take me perhaps an hour to write. They provided details about their work history and the type of position they were applying for, and I crafted a convincing reference letter supposedly from their previous manager. I felt uncomfortable about the deception, but I rationalized it by telling myself that everyone exaggerates on job applications, and I was just helping someone get their foot in the door. They probably had the skills they claimed, just not the documentation to prove it. The client was pleased with my work and recommended me to others who needed similar services. Within a few weeks, I was writing multiple reference letters each month, all for people who claimed to have employment gaps or difficult previous employers who wouldn't provide fair references. The money was keeping me afloat financially, and I convinced myself I was providing a legitimate service for people who'd been unfairly disadvantaged by circumstances beyond their control. After all, the job market was brutal, and sometimes good people needed a helping hand to compete with candidates who had more conventional career paths. But the requests started becoming more specific and troubling. Instead of general employment references, clients began asking for letters vouching for professional qualifications they clearly didn't possess. Teaching credentials, medical certifications, even security clearances for positions that required background checks. When I questioned whether I should be fabricating credentials for regulated professions, the clients assured me they had the necessary qualifications, but had lost their documentation or had problems with previous employers who were blocking their access to official records. The explanations were always plausible enough that I could convince myself I was helping victims of bureaucratic incompetence rather than enabling fraud. The rates increased as the requests became more demanding. I was soon earning more from writing fraudulent references than I had from my previous legitimate employment. The financial security was intoxicating after months of struggling to make rent. I developed a system for creating convincing reference letters that would pass casual scrutiny. I researched real companies and institutions, created plausible employment histories, even generated fake contact details that would redirect to voicemail boxes if anyone tried to verify the references. The work became almost routine. I'd receive a request with employment details, craft a convincing reference letter, and collect my fee. I stopped thinking about the consequences of what I was doing, treating it as just another writing assignment, rather than systematic fraud that was helping unqualified people access positions they had no business occupying. The breakthrough came when I saw a news report about a care home scandal in Yorkshire. Several elderly residents had died after receiving improper medication from a care worker who'd falsified her nursing credentials. The investigation revealed she'd been working in healthcare for over a year using fraudulent reference letters and fake certification documents. Something about the story felt familiar, and I checked my records to see if I'd ever written references for anyone in the healthcare sector. What I found made me feel physically sick. I'd written multiple reference letters for someone matching the care worker's description, fabricating employment history as a qualified nurse with years of experience in elderly care. I couldn't be certain it was the same person. My clients used pseudonyms and paid through anonymous channels, but the timing and details matched too closely to be coincidence. I'd probably helped an unqualified person get a job in a care home, where her incompetence had contributed to several deaths. The realization that my fraudulent reference letters might have enabled someone to kill vulnerable people, even unintentionally, was devastating. But what made it worse was understanding that this probably wasn't an isolated case. I'd written hundreds of reference letters over the past year, and I had no idea what positions those letters had helped people obtain, or what damage those unqualified individuals might have caused. I started researching my previous clients more carefully, trying to understand who I'd been helping and what positions they'd been applying for. What I discovered was far worse than I'd imagined. Many of my clients weren't just people with employment gaps or difficult previous employers. They were individuals who'd been barred from certain professions due to criminal convictions, incompetence, or professional misconduct. They were using my fraudulent references to circumvent the safeguards designed to protect vulnerable people from dangerous or incompetent workers. I found cases of people I'd helped get positions working with children, despite having convictions for child abuse. Others had accessed jobs in healthcare despite having been struck off professional registers for gross negligence. Some had even obtained security positions despite criminal backgrounds that should have disqualified them from such roles. The fraudulent references I'd been writing weren't just helping people exaggerate their qualifications. They were actively undermining the systems designed to protect vulnerable people from those who posed a danger to them. But what really disturbed me was discovering how my services were being advertised and shared. Using the same hidden internet channels where my clients had found me, I saw advertisements for reference writing services that explicitly targeted people who'd been banned from certain professions. The advertisements explained how my fraudulent references could help people circumvent background checks, access positions they were legally prohibited from holding, even target specific vulnerable populations like children or elderly people for exploitation. I realized I'd been part of an operation that systematically enabled dangerous people to access positions of trust and authority over vulnerable individuals. My writing skills were being weaponized to destroy the safeguards that protected those who needed protection most. Some of the discussion threads were horrifyingly explicit about why people needed fraudulent references. They talked about accessing care homes to exploit elderly residents, getting jobs in schools to target children, even obtaining positions in prisons or secure facilities to facilitate criminal activities. One thread discussed using fraudulent references to get hired at a women's refuge, with the explicit goal of gaining access to vulnerable domestic abuse victims. Another focused on targeting disability care services to exploit people who couldn't easily report abuse or defend themselves. I was looking at a systematic effort to place dangerous people in positions where they could harm the most vulnerable members of society, and I'd been helping them do it, writing convincing reference letters that enabled them to bypass the safeguards designed to prevent exactly this kind of infiltration. The guilt became overwhelming when I found a case that was definitely connected to my work. A man I'd written references for had been arrested for abuse while working at a residential facility for adults with learning disabilities. The investigation revealed he'd been barred from working in care services years earlier, but had used fraudulent references to obtain his current position. I recognized the specific employment history I'd fabricated for him, the fictional manager whose glowing recommendation I'd created, even some of the phrasing I'd used to describe his supposed experience and qualifications. There was no doubt I'd enabled this man to access vulnerable people he'd previously been prevented from harming. The news reports detailed the abuse he'd inflicted on residents who trusted him, who'd been placed in his care by families who believed the facility had properly vetted its staff. People had suffered because I'd been willing to write fraudulent references without asking enough questions about why someone needed my services. I tried to contact the authorities to report what I'd been doing and provide information about the fraudulent reference operation, but explaining my role without incriminating myself proved impossible. I'd been knowingly committing fraud for over a year, helping dangerous people circumvent safeguards, and I had no legal protection for coming forward. The police officer I spoke to was sympathetic but frank about the consequences I'd face if I provided evidence of my activities. I'd committed serious crimes that had enabled harm to vulnerable people, and cooperation wouldn't necessarily protect me from prosecution. I was advised to consult with a solicitor before providing any detailed information, but I couldn't afford legal representation on my meager freelance income. I was trapped between my guilt about what I'd enabled and my fear of facing criminal prosecution for my role in the fraud. That's when I decided to stop writing fraudulent references entirely and try to distance myself from the whole operation. I deleted all my client records, closed down my accounts on the freelance platforms, even destroyed my computer hard drive to eliminate evidence of what I'd been doing. But it was already too late to erase my involvement. The reference letters I'd written were still being used by dangerous people to access vulnerable populations. The damage I'd helped cause would continue long after I'd stopped enabling it. I started receiving messages from former clients asking why I was no longer available for reference writing services. Some were polite inquiries, but others had a threatening tone that made it clear they weren't happy about losing access to my services. One message in particular frightened me. A former client explained that they'd been relying on my references to maintain employment in their current position, and if I wasn't available to provide updated references for future applications, they might need to share information about my fraudulent activities with the authorities. I realized I was being blackmailed by someone I'd helped commit fraud. They were threatening to expose my illegal activities if I didn't continue enabling their deception, and there was nothing I could do about it without admitting my own complicity in systematic fraud. The threats escalated when I refused to resume writing references. Former clients began posting details about my real identity and location on the hidden internet channels where they'd originally found my services. They were exposing me to others who might be interested in preventing me from cooperating with authorities or revealing information about the fraud operation. I started noticing signs that I was being watched. People photographing me from across the street, cars following me around Leeds, even evidence that someone had been through my flat while I was out. The people I'd been helping had decided I was now a liability they needed to monitor and control. The final straw came when I received an envelope containing photographs of me going about my daily routine, along with a list of the vulnerable people who'd been harmed by individuals I'd provided references for. The message was clear. If I caused problems by going to the authorities, information about my role in enabling those harms would be shared widely. I realized I was being held hostage by my own guilt and complicity. The people I'd helped were using my knowledge of what I'd done to ensure I couldn't expose their ongoing activities without destroying my own life in the process. That's when I decided to leave Leeds entirely. I withdrew what little money I had in my bank account, packed essential belongings, and drove to Newcastle, where I hoped I could disappear for a while. I've been staying in budget hotels, moving every few days, trying to avoid establishing any pattern that might make me easy to find. But I know running away doesn't solve anything. The reference letters I wrote are still being used by dangerous people to access vulnerable populations. The safeguards I helped circumvent are still failing to protect those who need protection most. And the guilt I feel about my role in enabling harm to innocent people only grows heavier with each passing day. I keep thinking about the elderly people who died in that care home, the residents who were abused in the disability facility, all the other victims whose suffering was enabled by reference letters I wrote for a few £100s. They trusted that the people caring for them had been properly vetted, that the system had protected them from those who meant them harm. But I helped destroy that trust, helped dangerous people infiltrate the very institutions designed to protect vulnerable individuals. And I did it knowingly, consciously choosing to ignore the obvious warning signs because I needed money more than I cared about the potential consequences. The fraudulent reference operation continues without me. Other writers are probably being recruited to provide the same services I did, creating convincing documentation for people who've been barred from certain professions for good reason. The hidden internet channels where these services are advertised are still active, still connecting dangerous people with writers willing to help them circumvent safeguards. The systematic infiltration of care services, schools, and other institutions continues, enabled by people like me who value their financial security more than the safety of vulnerable people. Sometimes I wonder if I should have gone to the authorities immediately, despite the legal consequences I'd face. Whether preventing future harm would have been worth accepting punishment for the fraud I'd committed. But fear of prosecution and shame about what I'd done kept me silent until it was too late to prevent the worst consequences of my actions. I suppose I'm telling you this because I need someone to understand how easy it is to become complicit in terrible things when you're desperate for money, how the desire to pay rent and eat regularly can override your moral judgment until you're actively enabling harm to innocent people. And because I want you to understand that every time you trust an institution to protect vulnerable people, that trust depends on systems working properly and people acting ethically. But those systems can be circumvented by anyone with a few £100s and a willingness to hire someone like me who prioritizes their own financial security over the safety of others. The worst part is knowing that I can't undo the damage I helped cause. Can't protect the vulnerable people who are still being targeted by individuals I helped infiltrate care services and other trusted institutions. All I can do is hide in anonymous hotels and hope that eventually the guilt becomes bearable enough that I can sleep without seeing the faces of victims I never met, but helped harm nonetheless. I keep hoping someone with more courage than I have will expose these fraudulent reference operations before they enable more harm. But I'm not optimistic about that happening, because the people who profit from circumventing safeguards understand how to exploit desperate writers like me, how to insulate themselves from consequences, and how to ensure that their victims remain silent through fear and complicity. And in the meantime, vulnerable people continue to suffer because I was willing to write convincing lies for anyone who could pay my rate, without asking enough questions about why they needed my services or what they planned to do with the fraudulent credentials I provided. I'm not sure if I should have called the police straight away, but hindsight's a wonderful thing, isn't it? What happened was this. I came home to my flat to find a package that definitely wasn't mine sitting outside my door. Nothing unusual there. Happens all the time in student accommodation, where delivery drivers get confused about flat numbers and names. The label showed my address, but a completely different name. Someone called David Chen, who I'd never heard of. The package was from a medical supply company, which struck me as odd given that most students aren't ordering specialized medical equipment. But I figured maybe this David person had a condition that required particular supplies, and I'd just drop it round to wherever he actually lived once I worked out the correct address. That's when I made my first mistake. Instead of just leaving it for the delivery company to sort out, I decided to have a quick look online to see if I could find contact details for the intended recipient. It might save everyone some hassle if I could arrange for him to collect the item directly. Searching for David Chen in Glasgow turned up nothing useful. Too common a name. But when I looked more closely at the return address on the package, I noticed it wasn't from any medical supply company I could find online. The address led to what appeared to be a generic business park with multiple tenants, none of whom seemed to be in the medical supply business. Curiosity got the better of me, and I started digging deeper into where this package might actually have come from. The more I searched, the more I found myself following links to increasingly obscure websites that seemed to exist in corners of the internet I'd never encountered before. Eventually, I ended up on sites that required specific access methods and weren't indexed by normal search engines. Places where medical supplies were being sold without the usual regulatory oversight and customer verification that legitimate companies would require. The supplies being offered weren't your typical pharmacy items. These were specialized medical devices, pharmaceutical compounds, and equipment that would normally require prescriptions or professional medical supervision to obtain legally. Most concerning was that many items were being marketed for uses that had nothing to do with legitimate medical treatment. Substances described as useful for behavioral modification or compliance enhancement, devices that could be used for restraint or monitoring, even chemicals that seemed designed for incapacitating rather than treating people. I realized I might be holding a package containing materials that were intended for harming rather than helping someone. The medical supply company was a front for distributing items that could be used for assault, kidnapping, or worse. But that raised the question of who David Chen actually was, and why someone was having these materials delivered to an address near mine. Either he lived in the area and was involved in activities that required access to dangerous medical supplies, or someone was using a false name and approximate address to receive materials they couldn't obtain through legitimate channels. The package was heavier than I'd initially noticed, and when I shook it gently, I could hear what sounded like multiple small containers or vials moving around inside. This product is definitely not what you'd expect from normal medical supplies. I tried to research David Chen more systematically, looking through university records, local business directories, and social media to see if I could find anyone by that name who might legitimately be expecting medical deliveries. What I found instead were references to the same name being used in connection with various questionable online activities, forum posts about acquiring controlled substances, marketplace reviews for sellers of restricted items, even what appeared to be requests for services that couldn't be discussed on normal platforms. The name seemed to be a commonly used alias for people who needed to maintain anonymity while purchasing items or services that weren't available through legitimate channels. I was probably holding a package intended for someone involved in serious criminal activities, delivered to an address close enough to mine that they could collect it without being traced to their actual location. But I had no way of knowing whether the intended recipient was planning to use these materials against specific victims, or whether failing to deliver the package might prompt them to investigate what had happened to their order. If David Chen was expecting delivery of materials he planned to use for harming someone, discovering that his package had been intercepted might make him desperate enough to take risks to recover it. That could put me in danger if he decided I was a threat to his activities. On the other hand, if I delivered the package as intended, I'd be facilitating whatever crime he was planning to commit against innocent victims who had no idea they were being targeted. I decided the safest option was to dispose of the package without opening it or trying to return it to its intended recipient. If David Chen was involved in legitimate medical treatment, he could reorder his supplies through proper channels. If he was planning to harm someone, denying him access to these materials might prevent serious crimes. But getting rid of medical supplies safely required more thought than just throwing them in the bin. If the package contained controlled substances or hazardous materials, improper disposal could create environmental problems or give other people access to dangerous items. I tried to research proper disposal methods for unknown medical materials, but most guidance assumed you knew what substances you were dealing with and had obtained them legally in the first place. Eventually, I decided to take the package to the University Health Center and explain that I'd received someone else's medical delivery by mistake. They might be able to dispose of it safely or contact appropriate authorities if the contents appeared suspicious. But when I arrived at the health center, the staff seemed unusually interested in the package details and asked more questions than I'd expected about how I'd received it and what I knew about the intended recipient. Their reaction suggested they were familiar with packages containing questionable medical supplies and might have dealt with similar situations before. The health center staff seemed to have protocols for handling suspicious medical deliveries that weren't part of their normal patient care procedures. After providing detailed information about the package and signing several forms, I left thinking the situation was resolved. The health center would handle disposal appropriately, and I could forget about David Chen and whatever he'd been planning to do with his medical supplies. But that evening, I received a phone call from someone claiming to represent the medical supply company, asking about a delivery that had apparently gone missing from my address. They seemed to know specific details about the package and were very concerned about recovering their materials quickly. When I explained that I'd turned the package over to university authorities because it had been delivered to the wrong address, the caller became agitated and insisted that the materials were urgently needed for a legitimate medical emergency. They offered to arrange immediate collection from the health center and seemed willing to pay substantial compensation for any inconvenience I'd experienced due to the delivery error. The level of concern and urgency seemed excessive for a simple delivery mistake, especially from a company that was supposedly just sending routine medical supplies to a regular customer. I started to suspect that David Chen and the medical supply company were working together to recover materials that were much more valuable or dangerous than normal medical equipment. When I checked with the University Health Center the next day, they told me the package had already been collected by someone claiming to represent both the medical supply company and the intended recipient. The collection had happened within hours of my dropping it off, suggesting that David Chen and his associates had been monitoring the situation and were prepared to act quickly to recover their materials once they discovered where the package had ended up. But most disturbing was that the person who'd collected the package had provided detailed information about me, my name, course details, and home address, as proof that they were authorized to recover materials that had been mistakenly delivered to my location. They'd been watching me carefully enough to gather personal information that could be used to convince university staff that they had legitimate reasons for collecting the package I'd turned in. That meant David Chen and his associates now knew exactly who I was and where I lived, and they understood that I'd been curious enough about their activities to investigate the package rather than simply ignoring the delivery error. I'd gone from being an innocent bystander who'd received someone else's mail to being a person of interest for people who were involved in illegal medical supply distribution and potentially much more serious criminal activities. The package I'd tried to dispose of responsibly had instead led me into direct contact with people who now had reason to consider me either a potential threat to their operations or a possible recruit for activities that required access to the specialized medical supplies they'd been trying to obtain. When I got home that night, there was another package waiting outside my door, this time addressed to me personally and containing a handwritten note thanking me for my assistance with the previous delivery and inviting me to participate in what was described as a lucrative opportunity for students who were interested in discrete medical supply logistics. I never should have kept those photographs. Christ knows why I thought it was a good idea at the time. Some misguided notion about evidence, I suppose, or maybe just morbid fascination. Sitting here in this travelogue in Grimsby, 3 weeks after I packed up and left everything behind, I still can't shake the image of what I found in that house. I keep telling myself I was just doing my job, that I couldn't have known what I'd stumble into. But the truth is, I should have walked away the moment I realized something wasn't right. Should have minded my own business and left well enough alone. Now I'm looking over my shoulder every time I leave this room, wondering if they know what I saw, if they're coming for me next. I work as a house clearance specialist, worked I should say, since I doubt I'll be going back to that line of business anytime soon. It's not glamorous work, clearing out the homes of people who've died with no family to deal with their possessions. Mostly, it's just sad. Rooms full of things that meant everything to someone and nothing to anyone else. But it paid well enough, especially when you factored in the occasional valuable item that the executors had missed. The call came through my usual contact at the probate office in Sheffield. Elderly gentleman had passed away, no next of kin. Fairly standard situation. The house was a Victorian terrace in Rotherham. Nothing special from the outside, but probably worth a fair bit, once it was cleared and renovated. I was to remove all personal effects and furniture, leaving the property ready for sale. I'd done dozens of similar jobs over the years, so I didn't expect anything unusual when I collected the keys and let myself into the house that Tuesday morning. Standard layout for that type of property. Narrow hallway, front room, kitchen extension at the back, 3 bedrooms and a bathroom upstairs. The deceased gentleman had clearly lived alone for some time, judging by the layer of dust on everything and the general air of neglect. The downstairs was straightforward enough. The furniture was mainly comprised of inexpensive pieces that weren't worth rescuing. Kitchen cupboards full of tinned food that had expired years ago, a few pieces of old china that might fetch a few pounds at auction. There was nothing to suggest that the occupant had been anything other than an ordinary pensioner living quietly by himself. It was when I went upstairs that I started to notice things didn't quite add up. The main bedroom was sparse, just a single bed, a wardrobe with a few old clothes, and a bedside table with some reading glasses and a packet of paracetamol. But the second bedroom was different, much different. For one thing, it was clean. Not just tidy, but properly clean in a way that the rest of the house wasn't. The windows had been recently washed. The carpet looked like it had been professionally cleaned, and there wasn't a speck of dust anywhere. The room was almost entirely empty, except for a desk against one wall and a filing cabinet in the corner. The desk had obviously been used regularly. There were wear marks on the surface, and the chair was positioned as if someone had just stepped away from it. But there was nothing on the desk itself. No computer or paperwork or personal items. Just a clean surface and a drawer that was locked. I should have left it alone. I should have included the room in my report and allowed the estate agents to handle the contents. But curiosity got the better of me, and it wasn't difficult to force the drawer open with a screwdriver from my toolkit. Inside were three things: a set of car keys, a mobile phone that looked fairly new, and a memory stick. The keys were for a Ford, though I hadn't seen any car parked outside the house. The phone was switched off and needed a PIN to access. But the memory stick, well, that was what changed everything. I plugged it into my laptop, telling myself I was just checking if it contained anything relevant to the estate. Maybe financial records or important documents that the executors needed to see. What I found instead were photographs, hundreds of them, all stored in carefully organized folders. At first glance, they looked like the sort of pictures anyone might take. Houses, streets, people going about their daily business. But as I scrolled through them, I started to notice disturbing patterns. The same individuals appeared in multiple photographs taken over extended periods. The same houses were documented from different angles and at different times of day. This wasn't casual photography. It was systematic surveillance. Someone had been watching specific people and properties, documenting their routines and activities with methodical precision. The folders were labeled with initials and postcodes, suggesting a filing system that covered a wide geographical area. One folder in particular caught my attention because it was labeled with a postcode I recognized, the area where I lived in Sheffield. When I opened it, my blood went cold. There were photographs of my own street, my own house, even pictures of me loading equipment into my van on what must have been recent jobs. The surveillance wasn't random. I was one of dozens of people who had been systematically observed and catalogued. The photographs showed intimate details of my daily routine, when I left for work, what time I returned home, even which neighbors I spoke to regularly. But it was the final folder that made me understand the true scope of what I was looking at. It was simply labeled completed and contained photographs of houses I'd cleared over the past 2 years. Not just exterior shots, but interior photographs taken after I'd finished my work. Someone had been following up on every job I'd done, documenting the empty properties I'd left behind. The implications were terrifying. This wasn't just surveillance, it was preparation. Someone had been using my work schedule to identify properties that would be empty and vulnerable. They knew which houses had been cleared, which ones had no family checking on them, which ones were sitting empty, waiting to be sold. I spent the rest of that day going through every file on the memory stick, trying to understand the scope of the surveillance operation. There were photographs of dozens of people across South Yorkshire and beyond. Families, elderly individuals, young professionals, all documented with the same systematic attention to detail. Some files included additional information, work schedules, holiday plans, even details about security systems and spare key locations. It was like looking at a criminal intelligence database. Except the targets were all ordinary people, living normal lives. The most disturbing discovery was a section of files that contained what looked like floor plans and property layouts. These weren't professional architectural drawings, but hand-sketched maps showing room layouts, entry points, and security vulnerabilities. Many of them corresponded to houses I recognized from the surveillance photographs. I tried to convince myself there might be an innocent explanation for what I'd found. Maybe the old man had been some sort of private investigator, or perhaps he'd worked for an insurance company doing legitimate surveillance work. But the more I examined the files, the more obvious it became that this was something much darker. The photographs were taken covertly, often through windows or from concealed positions. The subjects clearly had no idea they were being watched, and the level of detail about their personal lives went far beyond anything that would be necessary for legitimate investigation work. I decided to take the memory stick to the police, but first I wanted to copy the files as backup evidence. That's when I made the mistake of accessing the internet to upload the photographs to cloud storage. The laptop connected to an unusual network, one that required special software to access. Out of curiosity, I explored some of the websites available through this network. What I found made me realize that the surveillance operation was much larger than just one person's obsession. There were entire communities dedicated to sharing intelligence about potential targets, coordinating surveillance activities, and planning break-ins. The photographs from the memory stick weren't just evidence of one person's criminal activity. They were part of a collaborative effort involving dozens of people across different regions. The surveillance subjects had been chosen systematically, with different individuals responsible for monitoring specific areas and target types. I found discussion boards where people shared techniques for following targets without being detected, advice on photographing properties from concealed positions, even guides for identifying vulnerable individuals who lived alone or had predictable routines. But most disturbing of all were the sections dedicated to completed operations. Detailed accounts of break-ins and burglaries that had been planned using surveillance intelligence. The perpetrators treated these crimes like collaborative projects, sharing photographs of stolen items and comparing the accuracy of their intelligence gathering. I recognized several of the properties from local news reports about burglaries over the past few months. Elderly residents who'd been targeted while they were at medical appointments. Families whose homes had been ransacked while they were on holiday. Even a few cases where people had been followed home and robbed in their driveways. The network wasn't just facilitating burglaries. They were also sharing information for stalking and harassment campaigns. I found files documenting systematic intimidation of individuals who had apparently done nothing more than catch the attention of someone in the surveillance network. One case file made me physically sick. A young mother in Barnsley had been subjected to months of harassment after someone in the network had identified her as a target. They documented her children's school schedules, her work routine, even the times when she was alone in the house. The harassment had escalated from anonymous phone calls to someone breaking into her garden and leaving threatening messages. The police investigation into her case had apparently stalled because the perpetrators were careful not to leave physical evidence. Everything was coordinated through the hidden network, making it almost impossible for traditional investigative methods to identify the people responsible. I realized I was looking at a new type of organized crime, one that used collaborative surveillance and online coordination to identify and exploit vulnerable targets. The old man whose house I was clearing hadn't been working alone. He'd been part of a distributed network that treated crime like a collaborative hobby. The worst part was understanding how I'd been used. My work clearing deceased persons' properties had made me an unwitting intelligence asset for the network. They'd been following my movements, documenting my jobs, using my work schedule to identify empty properties that could be targeted with minimal risk. Every house I'd cleared had potentially become a target for burglary or worse. Every family I'd helped by clearing their deceased relative's property had unknowingly been added to a surveillance database. I'd been facilitating crimes without even knowing it. I tried calling the police that evening, but explaining what I'd found was more complicated than I'd expected. The investigating officer seemed overwhelmed by the technical aspects of the hidden network and uncertain about how to proceed with evidence that had been gathered through what might be considered unauthorized access to computer systems. They took the memory stick and promised to investigate, but I got the impression that this was beyond their usual expertise. Cybercrime involving hidden networks wasn't something the local police were equipped to handle effectively. That's when I started noticing I was being watched. Cars that seemed to follow me between job sites, people who appeared in different locations but always seemed to be observing me from a distance. My house was photographed again. I found the images on the same hidden network sites I'd discovered earlier, but this time the surveillance felt different, more focused and threatening. The new photographs included close-ups of my front door, my car registration, even shots taken through my kitchen window. Someone had also accessed my personal information and posted it alongside speculation about what I might have discovered in the old man's house. The network had identified me as a threat and was now treating me as a target. Discussion threads speculated about whether I'd copied their files, whether I'd contacted the police, even whether I might need to be dealt with to prevent further exposure of their activities. I lasted 3 more days before I decided to run, packed a bag, withdrew what cash I could from my accounts, and drove to this seaside town where I hoped I could disappear for a while. Left my house, my business, even my cat with a neighbor who thinks I've gone away on holiday. But I don't think distance is going to protect me from people who've made surveillance and coordination their specialty. They've had weeks to document my habits, my relationships, my vulnerabilities. They probably know more about my life than I do. The police haven't contacted me since I gave them the memory stick, and I'm not sure they're equipped to shut down a network that operates entirely through hidden parts of the internet. These people have created a system that allows them to commit crimes with almost complete impunity, protected by technology that most law enforcement agencies don't understand. I keep thinking about all the people in those surveillance files, all the ordinary individuals who have no idea they're being watched and catalogued by criminals. Families going about their daily lives while strangers document their routines and plan ways to exploit their vulnerabilities. The old man is dead, but his network is still active, still watching, still planning, still treating other people's lives like a game where privacy doesn't matter and everyone else exists only as potential targets. Sometimes I wonder if I should have kept quiet, should have left the memory stick in that drawer and walked away from the whole thing. Maybe I'd still have my normal life, my business, my sense of security. But then I think about that young mother in Barnsley, about all the people who've been targeted because someone decided their privacy was worth less than criminal entertainment. And I know I couldn't have lived with myself if I'd done nothing. I just hope the police can make sense of what I gave them before this network claims any more victims, before they decide I'm too much of a risk to leave alone. Picture a scenario where you've worked somewhere for 8 years, put in the overtime, covered for colleagues when they called in sick, never missed a deadline, and then one Tuesday morning, your manager calls you into his office and tells you the company is restructuring. Your position is being eliminated. Effective immediately. Security will escort you out. And they'll post your belongings within a week. That's what happened to me 3 months ago. My name is Martin. I'm 42. And until recently, I was a project coordinator at a logistics company in Reading. Nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills, and I was good at it. The manager who fired me was a man called David Henley, someone who'd been brought in 6 months earlier to implement cost-cutting measures. He'd barely spoken to me before that Tuesday, but he delivered the news with the kind of professional detachment that suggested he'd done this many times before. What made it worse was that I knew the restructuring was selective. 3 people from my department were let go, but they kept on 2 others who did essentially the same work, just less efficiently. The decision seemed arbitrary, personal even, though I couldn't understand what I might have done to warrant being singled out. The first few weeks after losing the job were occupied with practical concerns. Updating my CV, applying for positions, dealing with benefits paperwork, explaining to friends and family why I was suddenly unemployed. But as the rejections started coming in and the savings began dwindling, the anger began building. Not just frustration at the job market or the economic situation, but genuine rage at David Henley specifically. I found myself thinking about him constantly, imagining confrontations where I'd tell him exactly what I thought of his management style, scenarios where he'd face consequences for his casual destruction of people's livelihoods. The fantasies became increasingly violent over time, though I told myself it was just a way of processing the stress and disappointment. Late one evening, after another day of fruitless job searching, I found myself researching David Henley online. Not for any specific purpose, just curiosity about the man who'd upended my life. His LinkedIn profile, company photos, mentions in trade publications. Nothing particularly revealing, but it felt like I was learning something useful about my enemy. The search led me to forums where people discussed workplace grievances and unfair dismissals. Most of the posts were routine complaints about bad managers and corporate policies, but some were more extreme. People talking about revenge fantasies, sharing stories about bosses who'd faced various misfortunes, discussing hypothetical scenarios that went well beyond anything I'd imagined. One forum in particular caught my attention. The discussions were coded and vague, but seemed to revolve around more serious forms of retaliation than just complaining online. Users would reference services and contacts in ways that suggested real-world consequences rather than just fantasy. The tone was matter-of-fact, practical, as if they were discussing hiring a tradesman rather than something far more serious. I started visiting that forum regularly, not posting anything myself, but reading through the discussions and trying to understand what was actually being offered. After several weeks of lurking, I received a private message from someone who'd noticed my browsing patterns. They didn't introduce themselves with any dramatic usernames or obvious criminal references, just someone called Mike, who seemed to understand what I might be looking for. The conversation that followed was surprisingly normal. Mike asked about my employment situation, my financial pressures, my feelings about the people responsible for my difficulties. He seemed genuinely sympathetic, offering practical advice about job searching alongside more pointed questions about my former manager. Sometimes he'd ask oddly personal things, how well I slept at night, whether I had family who worried about me, if I'd ever felt capable of crossing lines I wouldn't normally cross. I assumed it was just thorough customer service. Over several exchanges, Mike gradually introduced the idea that some workplace problems required more direct intervention than traditional legal channels could provide. He provided links to sites that looked like professional service directories, complete with user reviews and detailed pricing. The services range from relatively minor harassment to more permanent solutions. Everything was presented with corporate professionalism. No dramatic threats or criminal iconography, just matter-of-fact discussions of problems and solutions. The option I found myself considering was listed as executive adjustment services. The description was euphemistic but clear enough, and the reviews suggested genuine experience rather than imagination. The details felt just real enough, never specific enough to be incriminating. Mike seemed to sense my interest without me explicitly stating it. His messages became more focused on practical considerations, timelines, payment methods, information requirements for service providers. He spoke like someone managing a service contract, not arranging a crime. What made it feel legitimate was the systematic approach. They required detailed information about the target, including daily routines, security arrangements, and personal circumstances. The data collection process was thorough and professional, suggesting genuine operational capability rather than simple fraud or fantasy. I found myself gathering information about David Henley without quite admitting what I was planning to do with it. His home address, his car, his typical schedule, his family situation. The research felt purposeful and focused, giving me something constructive to do with the anger and frustration that had been building for months. The information gathering became increasingly detailed over time. I started following his routine, noting his lunch preferences, his gym schedule, his weekend activities. Not obviously stalking, just casual observation that helped me understand his patterns and vulnerabilities. The knowledge felt powerful, like I was finally taking control of a situation that had previously been entirely outside my influence. Mike's messages became more specific as I provided information. He would reference details I'd shared, suggest additional areas for research, and gradually build a comprehensive profile of David Henley's daily life. The collaboration felt professional and goal-oriented, like working on a legitimate project rather than planning something illegal. Around this time, I started noticing changes in my own circumstances that seemed oddly convenient. Job interviews for positions I didn't remember applying for. Meetings arranged by recruitment consultants I'd never contacted. Opportunities appearing with timing that felt deliberate. The interviews were for positions similar to my previous role, with companies that seemed legitimate enough. But the conversations would drift into uncomfortable territory. Questions about workplace stress, my thoughts on management accountability, whether I'd ever considered taking matters into my own hands when official channels failed. The interviewers seemed more interested in my emotional state than my professional qualifications. I began to wonder whether Mike's organization provided services beyond just executive adjustment, whether they were also involved in monitoring and managing clients, ensuring that people considering their services received appropriate guidance and support throughout the decision-making process. The job opportunities became more pressing over time. Offers for temporary positions that would require travel, consulting arrangements that would take me away from Reading for extended periods, opportunities that seemed designed to interrupt my research and planning activities. The timing felt too convenient to be coincidental. Mike's messages became more urgent as well. He mentioned limited availability for executive adjustment services, suggested that delays might affect pricing or scheduling, emphasized the importance of making decisions quickly before opportunities disappeared. The pressure was subtle but unmistakable. I arranged to meet Mike in person to finalize the arrangements, not at his suggestion, but because I wanted to confirm that I was dealing with legitimate professionals rather than elaborate scammers. The meeting was scheduled for a pub in central Reading, public enough to feel safe but private enough for sensitive discussion. Mike turned out to be exactly what I'd expected, middle-aged, professionally dressed, the sort of person you might encounter in any business context. But as we talked, I began to notice things that seemed inconsistent with the straightforward transaction I'd imagined. He seemed to know more about my personal circumstances than I'd shared in our online conversations, details about my financial situation, my housing arrangements, my social connections. When I asked direct questions about operational details, his answers became vague. He couldn't provide specific timelines, wouldn't explain methods, seemed reluctant to discuss practical aspects. Instead, he focused on my motivations. He wanted to understand why I felt David Henley deserved this level of intervention, whether I'd considered alternatives, how I planned to deal with the aftermath. The conversation felt more like a psychological evaluation than a business meeting. When I pressed for concrete commitments and timelines, Mike suggested that I needed more time to consider the decision properly. He recommended taking a few weeks to think through all the implications, perhaps exploring some of the job opportunities that had been appearing, reconsidering whether this level of intervention was really necessary. The meeting ended without any definitive arrangements being made. Mike gave me his contact details and suggested I should reach out when I was completely certain about proceeding. But something about his demeanor suggested that he expected me to change my mind rather than follow through with the original plan. Over the following days, I found myself questioning everything about the interaction. Whether Mike was actually connected to the services I thought I was purchasing, whether the whole setup was legitimate, whether I'd been dealing with professionals or something else entirely. By that point, the job offers had become more frequent and attractive. Legitimate positions with real companies, offering salaries that would resolve my financial difficulties immediately. Again, the timing felt too convenient, as if someone was actively working to provide alternatives to the executive adjustment services I'd been considering. I also started noticing that people seemed to recognize me more often. Once, a stranger mentioned the street I lived on in a casual conversation, though I didn't recall seeing him before. Another time, a shop assistant asked how my job search was going, though I'd never discussed it with anyone at that store. When I tried to contact Mike again, his account had been deactivated. The forums I'd been using showed error messages, and the service websites appeared to be under maintenance. All evidence of the executive adjustment option had become inaccessible. The job offers continued arriving though. Positions that seemed specifically designed for my skills and experience, with companies that had apparently heard good things about my work despite my recent unemployment. Opportunities that would require relocation, keeping me busy and providing new focus for my attention. I accepted one of them eventually. A project coordination role with a company in Birmingham, better salary than my previous position, responsibilities that felt familiar and comfortable. The interview process was surprisingly brief, and they seemed eager to have me start as soon as possible. 3 weeks after starting the new job, I learned that David Henley had been found dead in his home. Apparent heart attack, no signs of foul play. Nothing suspicious according to the police investigation. He was 45, no previous health problems, found by his wife when she returned from visiting her mother. The timing felt too convenient to be coincidental, but I had no way of determining whether his death was connected to my previous planning or simply random misfortune. I'd never completed any arrangements with Mike, never paid for any services, never provided final confirmation that I wanted to proceed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been part of something larger than I'd understood, that my research and planning had been monitored and incorporated into activities I hadn't been aware of, that what I started had finished itself, with or without my permission. The new job kept me busy enough to avoid dwelling on questions I couldn't answer. My colleagues were friendly, my manager was supportive, and the work environment felt positive in ways my previous employment never had. Life improved substantially, making it easier to forget about the strange period of unemployment and planning. Sometimes I wonder if it all started long before I lost that job. I found a photograph of myself sleeping in my own bed, taken from inside my bedroom, tucked under my kitchen door this morning. The timestamp shows it was captured 3 hours ago. I probably shouldn't tell you what I've learned about my neighbor, or about the dark web marketplace that's been using my street as a hunting ground. But if something happens to me, if I disappear on a Tuesday evening like the others, maybe someone will understand why. It started when Mrs. Henderson next door went into hospital. Nothing dramatic, just a routine hip replacement that turned complicated. She'd lived in the terraced house beside mine for nearly 20 years, and suddenly there was this emptiness where her daily routines used to be. No more Radio 4 drifting through the thin walls at 7 sharp each morning. No more clatter of her walking frame on the path when she collected her milk. The estate agent's board went up about a fortnight after she'd moved into the care home permanently. One of those cheerful yellow signs promising quick sales and competitive fees. I didn't think much about who might move in next. You never really do you? You just assume it'll be someone ordinary, a young family perhaps, or another pensioner looking to downsize. The new owner arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in early March. I only noticed because I was working from home that day, catching up on some freelance copywriting projects that had been piling up. Through my front window, I watched a battered white transit van pull up outside Mrs. Henderson's old place. No removal lorry, no boxes of furniture being carried in. Just one man with a heavy rucksack and what looked like a laptop bag. He was younger than I'd expected, probably somewhere in his 30s, with the sort of pale complexion that suggested he didn't spend much time outdoors. Dark hair that needed cutting, wearing a navy hoodie, and jeans that had seen better days. The kind of person you'd walk past in the street without a second glance. What struck me as odd wasn't his appearance, it was how he moved. He kept glancing around as he walked up the path, checking the neighboring houses, scanning the street like he was memorizing it. When he reached the front door, he spent several minutes just standing there before finally going inside. Not looking for keys or checking the address, just standing, watching. I told myself I was being nosy. New neighbors always seem a bit strange until you get used to them. But something about his behavior stuck with me, nagging away like a song you can't quite remember the words to. The next few weeks passed quietly enough. I'd occasionally catch glimpses of him through his windows late at night, always hunched over what appeared to be a computer screen. The blue glow was visible from my bedroom window if I happened to be up past midnight, which I was more and more often. My sleep had been disrupted since starting a new antidepressant, and I'd found myself padding around the house at strange hours, making cups of tea and staring out at the empty street. It was during one of these insomniac wanderings that I first saw him in his back garden. The terraced houses on our street all have small rectangular gardens separated by low brick walls. From my upstairs bathroom window, you can see into most of the neighboring yards. Mrs. Henderson had kept hers immaculate. Rose bushes, a small vegetable patch, one of those rotary washing lines that squeaked in the wind. Her replacement had different priorities. He was digging, not planting or weeding, but creating what looked like a series of rectangular plots about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. Neat, methodical excavations that he worked on in complete darkness, using only the light from his phone to guide him. The earth he removed was being carefully bagged and presumably disposed of elsewhere, because there was never any pile of soil visible during daylight hours. I counted 6 of these plots before I stopped watching. Something about the precise measurements made my stomach turn. The sensible thing would have been to assume he was planning some sort of garden renovation. Maybe he was one of those people who prefer to work at night to avoid curious neighbors. Maybe he had a day job that made evening gardening impossible. Maybe he was just eccentric, but the plots were too uniform, too deliberate, and they never seemed to get filled with plants or paving stones or anything else you might expect. I started keeping a casual eye on his activities, the way you might monitor roadworks outside your house or construction noise that's disrupting your routine. Not obsessively, just noting the patterns when they interrupted my own schedule. He seemed to work exclusively at night, always alone, always methodical. During daylight hours, his house appeared completely empty, no movement behind the curtains, no car in the narrow driveway. About a month after he'd moved in, I noticed something else unusual. My internet connection had become frustratingly slow, particularly in the evenings. Pages that should load instantly were taking 30 seconds or more. Streaming services buffered constantly. At first, I blamed my provider. They're always making excuses about network maintenance and peak usage periods. But when I checked my router settings one evening, trying to identify the problem, I discovered something that made me pause. There were multiple devices connected to my home network. Devices I didn't recognize, with names like Garden Cam and Monitor Node and Backyard Watch. I changed my wireless password immediately, but the unknown connections returned within hours. Someone was accessing my internet, and they were using it to run what appeared to be surveillance equipment. The thought that followed was immediate and unwelcome. My new neighbor worked at night, appeared to have no visible job, and was apparently tech-savvy enough to hack wireless networks. He was also creating precise rectangular excavations in his back garden. I tried to push the implications away, but they kept resurging like a persistent headache. Instead of sleeping, I found myself researching missing persons cases in our local area, scrolling through police appeals and newspaper articles about people who had vanished without explanation. There were more than I'd expected. Young women, mostly, who had simply failed to return home from work or nights out. Cases that had gone cold after the initial investigations yielded nothing. The dates troubled me. Several of the disappearances had occurred in the months before Mrs. Henderson went into hospital, when the house next door had been empty and available. A convenient base of operations for someone who needed privacy and direct access to neighboring properties. I know what you're thinking, that I was letting paranoia get the better of me, creating connections where none existed. That's certainly what I told myself during the rational daylight hours when my theories seemed ridiculous and overblown. But the nighttime excavations continued, and my internet remained compromised despite multiple password changes and router resets. Worse still, I'd started noticing small signs that my own property was being observed. Scratches around my back door lock that I didn't remember. Footprints in the flower bed beneath my kitchen window that appeared overnight and were gone by morning. The feeling, growing stronger each day, that I was being watched from the house next door. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. I'd been idly browsing social media one evening when I noticed a post from Sarah Collins, a woman I'd known vaguely at secondary school. She was sharing a missing person appeal for her younger sister Emma, who had disappeared 3 weeks earlier after leaving work at a restaurant in the city centre. Emma's photograph showed a slight girl with dark hair and pale skin, wearing a navy jacket. The description mentioned that she'd been carrying a laptop bag and was known to walk home alone late at night. The similarity to my neighbour was striking enough to give me pause, but what really caught my attention was a detail buried in the appeal text. Emma had been active on various online communities, particularly ones focused on privacy and internet security. Her sister mentioned that she'd been exploring the darker corners of the web, researching topics that had become increasingly concerning to her family. I stared at Emma's photograph for a long time, thinking about rectangular plots and surveillance equipment and the pale young man who worked exclusively in darkness. Then I did something I'd been avoiding for weeks. I accessed the dark web. I won't go into the technical details of how that works. There are enough guides available if you're genuinely curious. What matters is that within an hour of browsing, I'd found what I was looking for. A marketplace buried several layers deep in the hidden internet, accessible only through specific channels and invitation systems. The site was called Garden Services, which should have been my first warning about what I was about to discover. It advertised itself as a community for people interested in discreet disposal solutions and property maintenance. The language was coded, euphemistic, but the underlying meaning was unmistakable once you understood the context. They were selling access to live streams. The feeds were categorized by location, with familiar postcodes and area names that made my hands shake as I scrolled through them. Most were listed as currently offline or archive access only, but there were half a dozen showing green status indicators suggesting active content. I clicked on one marked with my own postal district. The video quality was grainy, filmed from multiple angles that suggested carefully positioned cameras. The location appeared to be underground, probably a basement or converted cellar. The lighting was harsh and clinical, throwing sharp shadows across concrete walls. There were 6 separate enclosures visible in the main view. Rectangular spaces divided by metal barriers, each one approximately 6 feet by 3 feet. The same dimensions as the excavations in my neighbor's garden. 5 of the spaces appeared to be occupied. I slammed the laptop shut immediately, my heart hammering so hard I thought I might be sick. But the images had already burned themselves into my memory. The makeshift cells, the surveillance equipment, the careful documentation of what was happening in that underground space. I sat in my darkened living room for nearly an hour, trying to process what I'd seen and decide what to do about it. The rational part of my brain insisted I should contact the police immediately, report my suspicions and let trained professionals handle the investigation. But another part wondered what evidence I actually had. Unusual gardening habits and network intrusions weren't necessarily criminal activities. The dark web marketplace could be located anywhere in the world, operated by people with no connection to my neighbor or my street. Even if I reported everything I'd discovered, would anyone take it seriously enough to act? While I was debating internally, I heard the back gate creak open next door. Through my kitchen window, I could see the familiar hooded figure making his way across the garden in complete darkness. He was carrying what looked like a spade and several large plastic sacks, moving with the same methodical precision I'd observed over the previous weeks, heading directly toward the excavated plots. I watched him work for 20 minutes, filling in one of the rectangular spaces and immediately beginning work on a new one nearby. The displaced earth went into the plastic sacks, which he loaded into a wheelbarrow and presumably disposed of elsewhere. By the time he finished and returned indoors, there was no visible trace of his activities. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day researching Emma Collins' disappearance in greater detail. I found social media profiles that painted a picture of someone curious and technically minded, exactly the sort of person who might stumble across the wrong section of the dark web. Her final posts were about online privacy and digital security, subjects that could easily lead someone into dangerous territory if they weren't careful about their research methods. The timeline was troubling. Emma had vanished on a Tuesday evening 3 weeks earlier. My neighbor had been working in his garden on Tuesday nights ever since, always filling in existing plots and creating new ones. I tried to convince myself I was making unjustified connections, but the pattern was too consistent to ignore, particularly when I discovered that 2 other recent missing persons had also disappeared on Tuesday evenings, both young women with interests in technology and internet security. The kind of people who might be drawn to explore hidden marketplaces and underground communities. The kind of people who might accidentally attract the attention of someone offering discreet disposal services. That evening, I made my decision. I waited until nearly midnight when the familiar sounds of digging began next door, then made my way carefully through my back garden to the low brick wall that separated our properties. The height difference gave me a clear view of his activities, and what I saw confirmed my worst suspicions. He wasn't just creating burial plots. He was maintaining an underground facility that connected directly to his cellar through a series of concealed access points. The garden excavations were ventilation shafts and emergency exits for a much larger operation taking place beneath ground level. While I watched, he spent nearly an hour checking each of the rectangular spaces, using a torch to examine what appeared to be concealed drainage systems and air circulation equipment. This wasn't the improvised setup of someone acting on impulse. It was a carefully engineered facility designed for long-term operation. I had my phone ready to record evidence, but before I could begin filming, he looked up directly at me. We stared at each other for several seconds across the garden wall. His expression was calm, almost curious, as if my presence was expected rather than surprising. Then he smiled and gave a small wave, like a neighbor acknowledging another neighbor during a chance encounter. I ducked down immediately, my heart pounding, and made my way back to my house as quietly as possible. Once inside, I triple-locked the doors and closed all the curtains, trying to process what had just happened. He'd seen me watching him, seen me recording his activities, and instead of appearing concerned or defensive, he'd seemed pleased about it. The implications made my skin crawl, but I couldn't shake the feeling that his reaction had been planned, that he'd wanted me to discover what he was doing, wanted me to know exactly what was happening in the house next door. I spent the rest of the night sat in my front room with all the lights on, waiting for sounds from next door that never came. No digging, no footsteps, no indication that anyone was awake in the neighboring house. Just silence that felt more threatening than any noise could have been. The next morning, I found an envelope on my kitchen table, not pushed through the letterbox or left on the doorstep. On my kitchen table, inside my locked house, positioned exactly where I'd left my coffee mug the previous evening. The envelope contained a single photograph and a handwritten note. The photograph showed me standing at my bedroom window, taken from somewhere in the neighboring garden. I was clearly visible despite the darkness, captured in sharp detail that suggested professional surveillance equipment. The timestamp in the corner indicated it had been taken several weeks earlier, long before I'd started paying attention to my neighbor's activities. The note was brief and written in neat, precise handwriting. It simply read, "Garden Services is always looking for new contributors. Your documentation skills would be valuable to our community. We'll be in touch soon. I'm writing this 3 months later, and I still haven't contacted the police. Not because I don't want to help Emma Collins and the others who disappeared, but because I'm too frightened of what might happen if I do. The envelope proved that my neighbor could access my house whenever he chose, that he'd been watching me long before I'd started watching him, that my investigation into his activities had been noted and potentially encouraged from the very beginning. But there's something else that stops me from seeking help, something I discovered when I finally worked up the courage to check the Garden Services website again. There's a new section now, marked Upcoming Content, with a familiar address listed beneath it, my address. The preview shows a photograph of my own back garden, taken from multiple angles, with precise measurements for rectangular excavations that haven't been started yet. I haven't seen my neighbor for weeks now, but I know he's still there, still watching, still planning, still maintaining his underground facility while he waits for the right moment to expand operations. The house next door looks completely empty during the day, but I can see the blue glow of computer screens late at night. And sometimes, when the wind is in the right direction, I can hear sounds from beneath the ground that I try very hard not to think about. I keep telling myself I should pack up and leave, find somewhere far away where Garden Services can't reach me. But I know it wouldn't make any difference. They've already documented my movements, my routines, my vulnerabilities. They know exactly where to find me whenever they decide the time is right. So I stay here, keeping the curtains drawn and the doors locked, writing down everything I've discovered in case someone finds it useful later. In case anyone wonders what happened to me when I inevitably disappear on a Tuesday evening, just like Emma Collins and all the others. The excavations in my garden haven't started yet, but I know they will. The measurements are already planned, the drainage systems designed, the surveillance equipment tested and ready. I just have to wait for my turn to contribute to the community that's been watching me all along. Everyone has a shadow self, the person we become when no one is watching, when the mask slips and our private thoughts emerge. I always considered mine relatively harmless. Late-night rabbit holes of research on obscure topics, occasionally watching people in cafes, imagining their lives, sometimes typing out angry emails I'd never send. Normal stuff. At least that's what I told myself. I teach digital media studies at a mid-tier university. It's not groundbreaking work, but it keeps me engaged, analyzing how technology shapes communication, behavior, and culture. My research specialty is online community formation, particularly around niche interests. This focus has taken me to some fascinating corners of the internet over the years, though always as an academic observer rather than a participant. 3 months ago, I began a new research project on anonymity and digital identity. The plan was straightforward. Examine how people behave differently in spaces where their real-world identity is disconnected from their online actions. I focused initially on anonymous forums, encrypted messaging platforms, and identity-obscuring applications. Standard academic research conducted within ethical guidelines, with IRB approval and proper protocols. What I didn't include in my research proposal was my growing curiosity about truly anonymous spaces, the layers of the internet inaccessible through standard browsers. I had read the academic literature on so-called dark web networks, understood their legitimate uses for privacy-conscious users, journalists, and dissidents, but I had never actually navigated those spaces myself. It represented a gap in my experiential knowledge, one that increasingly felt like a limitation in my research. So I installed a specialized browser, followed basic security protocols, and began exploring. The experience was initially underwhelming. The dark web resembled the early internet. Text-heavy pages with minimal design, slow loading times, frequent dead links. Most sites were marketplaces for illicit goods, financial services operating outside regulation, or forums discussing privacy technology and philosophy. Nothing particularly shocking or unexpected. About 2 weeks into my exploration, I discovered a subforum dedicated to discussing something called experience rooms. The conversation was deliberately vague, full of insider terminology and oblique references. Members debated the authenticity of various rooms, sharing technical criteria for evaluating legitimacy, but never explicitly stating what these rooms actually contained. The ambiguity intrigued me professionally. It was a perfect example of how communities develop coded language to both include insiders and exclude outsiders. One username appeared consistently in these discussions: Analyst Prime. Unlike most participants who either celebrated or debunked various rooms, Analyst Prime took a clinical, almost academic approach. They discussed psychological profiles of viewers and subjects, reference engagement metrics and response patterns, and occasionally mentioned a research framework they had developed. Their posts contained the kind of analytical language I might use in my own academic work, which perhaps explains why I found them credible when others seemed like sensationalists. After observing the forum for several days, I sent Analyst Prime a private message explaining my research interest in anonymous communities and asking for clarification about these experience rooms they discuss so analytically. I expected to be ignored or rebuffed. Instead, I received a prompt response, asking about my academic background and research methodologies. We exchanged several messages discussing psychology, digital ethnography, and observation bias. Analyst Prime eventually explained that experience rooms were live streaming platforms where viewers could observe people in various situations without the subject's knowledge. Most were fraudulent, pre-recorded content or paid actors pretending to be unwitting participants. But some, they claimed, were genuine. Analyst Prime described themselves as a behavioral researcher studying the psychology of both the observers and the observed in these environments. They offered to show me an authentic room for academic purposes. I should have declined. I should have ended the conversation, deleted the browser, and continued my research through legitimate channels. Instead, I told myself this was a unique research opportunity, a chance to understand a digital phenomenon firsthand, rather than through second-hand accounts. Analyst Prime sent me an address and access credentials for what they called an observation session, scheduled for 2 a.m. the following night. They explained that this particular stream would be appropriate for a first-time academic observer. No illegal activities, no explicit content, just authentic human behavior under observation conditions. They recommended I prepare by reading several psychological papers on voyeurism and surveillance effects, which they linked to normal web academic repositories. The legitimacy of these references lowered my guard further. At 1:55 a.m., sitting in my darkened home office, I accessed the address using the credentials provided. The site had a minimalist interface, black background, a video player in the center, a data panel to the right showing various metrics, and a small text field below for observer notes. No chat function, no visible usernames of other viewers. The video initially showed an empty room, white walls, hardwood floor, a single chair in the center. A timer in the corner indicated the stream would begin in 5 minutes. While waiting, I examined the data panel. It displayed numerous metrics, Current viewer count, 17. Average heart rate of viewers, 72 beats per minute. Average pupillary response, estimated engagement levels, and something labeled empathic resonance score. The sophistication of the analytics suggested serious technology behind what appeared visually to be a simple streaming setup. At precisely 2 a.m., a person entered the frame and sat in the chair. They were ordinary looking, dressed in casual clothes, their face visible but unremarkable. They seemed unaware of the camera, occasionally checking their phone or adjusting their position in the chair. Nothing dramatic or unusual happened. They simply sat, waited, occasionally showing signs of mild impatience or boredom. 10 minutes into this uneventful stream, I noticed changes in the metrics panel. Viewer heart rates had increased slightly. The empathic resonance score was rising. Most notably, my own heart was beating faster despite the mundane scene. A new metric appeared. Anticipation factor, 78%. I couldn't understand why watching someone simply sitting would generate anticipation, yet I felt it too, a growing tension without clear cause. After 20 minutes, the person in the chair checked their watch, stood up, and walked out of frame. The room remained empty for approximately 30 seconds. Then a different person entered and sat down. This new individual also seemed unaware of being recorded, also checked their phone periodically, also displayed mild impatience. The same scenario repeated with no significant variation. What changed dramatically were the metrics. Viewer heart rates increased further. Pupillary response showed significant dilation. The empathic resonance score dropped while anticipation factor rose to 91%. My own physiological response matched these trends. I felt tense, expectant, though nothing objectively tension-inducing was occurring. I recognized this as a conditioned response. Something about this particular setup, an ordinary person waiting alone in a room, had trained regular viewers to anticipate something significant. After 15 minutes, the second person left just as the first had done. The room remained empty again, briefly, before a third individual entered. As this pattern continued, I began to see subtle differences in how each person behaved in the apparently identical situation. Some seemed relaxed, others visibly anxious. Some checked the time frequently. Others seemed content to wait. The observer's metrics fluctuated with each new subject, suggesting viewers were making judgments, forming preferences, developing expectations. The clinical nature of the observation disturbed me more than any explicit content would have. The sophisticated measurement of viewer responses, the controlled environment, the rotation of unwitting subjects. This wasn't amateur voyeurism, but something methodical, researched, purposeful. I was witnessing what appeared to be a psychological experiment with non-consenting participants on both sides. The observed subjects unaware of the viewers, and possibly the viewers themselves unaware of being studied through their physiological responses. After an hour, I closed the stream and immediately sent a message to Analyst Prime expressing ethical concerns about the consent issues involved. Their response came quickly, thanking me for my participation and noting that my observer metrics showed particularly interesting patterns for a first-time viewer. They explained that my heart rate, pupillary response, and attention patterns had been measured through my device's camera, a camera I had never authorized to be activated. I immediately covered my webcam with tape and ran security scans on my system. Finding nothing obvious, I still felt profoundly violated. Analyst Prime sent another message, assuring me that my data would be used anonymously and offering to share the resulting analysis for my own research. They seemed genuinely unable to understand why I might object to being monitored without consent, even while studying others being monitored without consent. The cognitive dissonance was remarkable. I didn't respond to their message. Instead, I uninstalled the specialized browser, documented my experience in an encrypted file, and tried to process what I had witnessed. The next morning, I received an email to my university account, an account I had never shared with Analyst Prime. The subject line read, "Observer Study Follow-up." The message contained a link to what was described as your observer profile based on last night's session. Against better judgment, I clicked the link using a virtual machine on a secure connection. The page displayed a detailed analysis of my viewing patterns during the previous night's stream, which subjects held my attention longest, microsecond measurements of my reactions to specific movements or expressions, comparison of my response patterns to other first-time viewers. Most disturbing was a section labeled Observer Typology Classification that categorized me as a pattern recognition dominant viewer with above-average empathic suppression and researcher consistent cognitive framework. The accuracy of this analysis from just 1 hour of unknown surveillance was deeply unsettling. More troubling was the final section of the report, which predicted with specific probability percentages how likely I would be to discuss the experience with colleagues, 17%, report it to authorities, 12%, return for additional observation sessions, 64%, or attempt to investigate further independently, 89%. The last prediction proved immediately accurate. I began researching experience rooms through legitimate academic databases and cybersecurity resources. Most scholarly references dismissed them as urban legends or scams. Law enforcement bulletins mentioned them only as potential fraud schemes rather than actual surveillance operations. The few credible mentions described them as elaborate role-playing scenarios rather than non-consensual observation. A week later, I received another email, this time containing only a date, time, and link. No message, no explanation. Just another observation session invitation. I ignored it. 3 days after that, another invitation arrived. Then another. The frequency increased to daily, then twice daily. Each invitation came from a different email address, making blocking ineffective. 2 weeks into this escalating pattern, I received something different, a link labeled Subject Perspective. When I accessed it through a secure system, it showed a video feed from my own office, recorded the previous day. The camera angle suggested it came from my computer's webcam, which remained covered with opaque tape. Somehow, they were still watching. I replaced my computer entirely, changed my phone, installed advanced security systems in my home, swept for hidden cameras and microphones, found nothing. Yet the invitations continued, now arriving through text messages, professional networking platforms, even comments on my academic articles, always with a date, time, and link, never with further explanation. After a month of this, I received a different type of message, an observation report similar to my own, but focused on a colleague in my department. It analyzed their viewing patterns, psychological responses, and behavioral predictions in the same clinical format as mine. The message implied that my colleague had been invited to an observation session because of their association with me. The final line read, "Observer networks expand through proximity patterns. Your data suggested 6 high compatibility potential observers in your immediate circle." I confronted my colleague cautiously, asking if they had received any unusual invitations recently. Their confused response confirmed they had no knowledge of what I was describing. I chose not to elaborate, not wanting to draw them further into whatever this was. But the implication was clear. My involvement had somehow marked those around me as potential participants. Yesterday, I received the most disturbing communication yet. Not an invitation or a report, but a video file. It showed a compilation of moments from my daily life over the previous week. Me teaching class, buying groceries, meeting with students, working in my office. Each clip was brief, captured from different angles and distances. Some appeared to come from security cameras or colleagues' devices. Others had no plausible source I could identify. The compilation ended with footage of me sleeping in my bedroom the previous night, shot from an angle that suggested a camera in the smoke detector. The file's metadata included viewing statistics. 27 observers had watched this compilation of my life. Their average heart rate, pupillary response, engagement levels, and empathic resonance scores were listed in precise detail. My existence had become content for the very system I had tried to study. This morning, I discovered a new application on my phone that I never installed. Simply labeled Observer, its icon is a minimalist eye design. I can't delete it. When opened, it shows only a counter currently reading 31 and a timer counting down from 24 hours. I don't know what happens when it reaches 0. I've turned off the phone, but found the same application appearing on my new laptop minutes later. I'm writing this account now as documentation and warning. I don't know who or what Analyst Prime represents. I don't know the purpose of these observation networks or why they focus so intently on expanding through my social connections. What I do know is that the line between observer and observed has completely collapsed in my life. Every moment now exists as potential content, every reaction as data for analysis. The most terrifying realization isn't that I'm being watched, is that I've begun watching myself through their framework, analyzing my own reactions, considering how they might appear to observers, modifying my behavior to affect the metrics I imagine are being recorded. My internal experience has been colonized by the observation paradigm. I've internalized the clinical gaze that was directed at me. The counter on the Observer app now reads 28. Whatever happens when it reaches 0, I doubt it represents the end of this experience. More likely, it marks a transition to a new phase, perhaps from passive subject to active participant in ways I can't yet imagine. The only certainty is that in a system designed to categorize everyone as either observer or observed, eventually everyone becomes both simultaneously. The feedback loop never ends. It only expands to include more unwitting participants, more data points, more patterns to analyze. I've been trying to work out when exactly I should have stopped, At what point did this stop being a bit of harmless curiosity and turn into something I should have walked away from? I lie awake some nights, replaying it all, wondering if I'm the sort of person who is always capable of ignoring the obvious warning signs, or if desperation just has a way of making you blind to things you'd normally see clear as day. I used to manage property listings for a lettings agency in Sheffield. Nothing glamorous, just photographing flats and writing descriptions for rental websites. But then someone offered me money to do similar work for properties that weren't exactly available through normal channels, and I convinced myself it was all legitimate because I needed to believe it was. I'm staying with my sister in Glasgow now, as far from Sheffield as I could reasonably get without leaving the country, and I still don't feel safe because I finally understand what those listings were really for, what I was helping these people do, and I know they won't be happy that I've worked it out. The whole thing started about 10 months ago when the lettings agency I worked for went into administration. One day, I'm photographing a 3-bedroom terrace in Hillsborough. The next, I'm being told they can't make payroll, and we're all being let go with immediate effect. I was 42 years old, with a mortgage and no savings to speak of. Watching my entire career disappear overnight, I tried finding similar work with other agencies, but the property market was going through one of its periodic collapses, and nobody was hiring. I signed on at the job centre and started applying for anything that seemed remotely suitable, but weeks turned into months with nothing but rejection emails and silence. That's when I got the message through a professional networking site. Someone had seen my portfolio of property photography and was interested in commissioning similar work for a private client. The rate they offered was nearly double what I'd been earning at the agency. £1,500 per property, paid immediately upon completion. I should have been suspicious about why anyone would pay such generous rates for basic property photography, but I was desperate enough to overlook the obvious questions. The client explained they represented overseas investors who needed detailed documentation of UK properties for their portfolio assessments. The first assignment seemed straightforward enough. I was given an address in Rotherham, a modest, semi-detached house in a quiet residential area, and asked to photograph the exterior and, if possible, gather information about the interior layout. The client provided specific requirements about camera angles, lighting conditions, even particular features they wanted documented. When I arrived at the property, I quickly realized this wasn't a house that was for sale or rent. There were curtains in the windows, a car in the driveway, even children's toys scattered in the front garden. This was someone's home, and I was being paid to photograph it without the occupant's knowledge or consent. I almost walked away then, but the client had paid half the fee upfront, and I'd already spent most of it on overdue bills. So I convinced myself I was just taking photographs from a public street. Nothing technically illegal about documenting buildings that anyone could see. I took the exterior shots as requested, making sure to capture all the angles and features the client had specified. Then I walked around to the back alley and photographed the rear of the property as well, noting the security arrangements and access points as the brief had requested. When I submitted the photographs, the client was pleased with my work and paid the remaining fee immediately. They also offered me another assignment for the following week, a different property in Doncaster with similar requirements. Over the next few months, I photographed dozens of properties across South Yorkshire. All of them were occupied homes rather than properties for sale, and all required the same detailed documentation of security features, access points, and daily activity observations. The assignments came with increasingly specific requirements. I was asked to note what time residents left for work, whether they had security systems or dogs, even to identify which windows were typically left open during warm weather. The client claimed this information helped their investors assess neighborhood security and property maintenance standards. But I was starting to understand that I wasn't documenting properties for investment purposes. I was conducting surveillance for people who intended to break into these homes. The detailed information I was gathering would allow burglars to identify vulnerable properties, plan their approach, and minimize the risk of being caught. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid, that there were innocent explanations for why overseas investors might need such detailed security assessments. But the evidence was mounting that I'd been recruited to provide reconnaissance for organized crime. The breakthrough came when I was assigned to photograph a property in Chapeltown. The house was a neat bungalow occupied by an elderly couple who I'd occasionally see tending their garden when I drove past during my surveillance work. The client's brief was more detailed than usual. They wanted photographs documenting the couple's daily routine, the times when the property was empty, even close-up shots showing the type of locks on the doors and windows. This wasn't property assessment. It was target reconnaissance for people planning to victimize vulnerable elderly residents. I couldn't ignore what I was really doing anymore. I'd been providing intelligence that enabled criminals to identify and exploit the most vulnerable members of our community. Every photograph I'd taken, every security assessment I'd compiled, had probably contributed to someone's home being burgled. But I couldn't just stop accepting assignments without facing serious consequences. I'd become financially dependent on the income, and the client had made it clear they valued discretion above all else. People who cause problems for their operation might face difficulties of their own. I started keeping detailed records of all my assignments, documenting which properties I'd surveilled and what information I'd provided. I told myself I was preserving evidence in case I needed to cooperate with law enforcement. But really, I was just trying to feel less guilty about what I was doing. That's when I discovered the client wasn't just commissioning surveillance from me. They were coordinating dozens of reconnaissance operatives across the country, building a comprehensive database of vulnerable properties and their security arrangements. The operation used hidden internet channels to coordinate activities and share intelligence. I only discovered this because the client sent me login credentials to access their secure communication system, apparently deciding I was trustworthy enough to participate in their wider operations. What I found when I accessed their system was more sophisticated and extensive than I'd imagined. They had detailed profiles of thousands of properties across the UK, all compiled by operatives like me who'd been recruited to conduct surveillance work. The properties were categorized by vulnerability factors: elderly occupants, single parents, families with young children, even specific details about medical conditions or disabilities that might make residents less able to defend their homes. This wasn't opportunistic burglary. It was systematic targeting of the most defenseless members of society. Each property listing included comprehensive intelligence gathered from multiple sources. My photographs and observations were combined with information from other operatives who'd posed as utility workers, charity collectors, even care service providers, to gain access to homes and assess their contents. Some listings included floor plans sketched by people who'd been inside the properties, detailed inventories of valuable items, even assessments of residents' psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited during home invasions. The operation was treating burglary like a business enterprise, with professional standards and systematic intelligence gathering. They'd industrialized home invasion, creating an efficient system for identifying targets, planning approaches, and maximizing the value extracted from each crime. But what really disturbed me was discovering that some of the listings weren't just for burglary. Certain properties were marked with special designations that indicated they'd been selected for more serious criminal activity. I found discussions among the operatives about properties that could be used for other purposes once the residents had been driven out through harassment or intimidation. Homes that might be suitable for illegal operations, properties in strategic locations that could be taken over by criminals once the legitimate occupants had been sufficiently terrorized. One thread discussed an elderly woman in Barnsley whose home had been repeatedly burgled until she'd agreed to move into a care facility. The property was then rented to criminals who used it as a base for drug dealing, with the original owner having no idea her former home was being exploited for illegal purposes. Another discussion focused on a family in Meadowhall who'd been subjected to escalating harassment until they'd sold their house at below market value. The property had been purchased through a front company and was now being used for purposes the operatives wouldn't specify in their online communications. I realized I'd been part of an operation that went far beyond simple burglary. These people were systematically identifying and exploiting vulnerable residents, not just stealing their possessions, but driving them from their homes and taking over the properties for criminal enterprises. The surveillance work I'd been doing wasn't just enabling individual crimes. It was facilitating a form of domestic terrorism that destroyed people's lives and communities. Every property I documented was potentially being targeted not just for theft, but for systematic harassment, designed to drive out legitimate residents. I started researching the properties I'd surveilled, checking local news reports and crime statistics to see what had happened after I'd submitted my intelligence. What I found confirmed my worst fears. Many of the properties had been burgled within weeks of my surveillance work, often multiple times in quick succession. The burglaries showed intimate knowledge of the residents' routines and security arrangements, suggesting they'd been planned using the intelligence I had provided. But some properties had experienced worse than simple burglary. Several families had been subjected to sustained harassment campaigns that seemed designed to force them to relocate. Vandalism, threatening behavior, even violent confrontations that escalated until the residents felt they had no choice but to move away. A few properties had been taken over entirely after the original occupants had left. Criminals had moved in and established operations that turned quiet residential streets into centers for drug dealing, prostitution, and other illegal activities. I was looking at a systematic campaign to destabilize working-class communities by driving out vulnerable residents and replacing them with criminal enterprises. My surveillance work had been part of a coordinated effort to hollow out neighborhoods and create spaces where organized crime could operate with minimal interference. The elderly couple in Chapeltown, whose home I'd surveilled, were among the victims. They'd been burgled twice in the space of a month, losing possessions that had sentimental rather than financial value. The second burglary had traumatized them so badly they'd moved in with their daughter, leaving their home empty and vulnerable. I checked the property listing system and saw their house had been marked as vacant and available for criminal use. Someone was planning to take advantage of the empty property, probably using it for illegal operations, while the elderly couple paid the mortgage on a home they were too frightened to return to. That's when I realized I couldn't continue being part of this operation, regardless of the financial or personal consequences. I'd been helping to destroy communities and victimize the most vulnerable people in society, all because I'd been too desperate and too cowardly to walk away when I should have. I tried contacting the police to report what I'd discovered, but explaining the technical aspects of the operation proved more complicated than I'd expected. The officer I spoke to seemed confused by my descriptions of hidden internet channels and coordinated criminal intelligence gathering. They took a statement and promised to investigate, but I could tell they were overwhelmed by the scope of what I was describing. Organized crime operations using sophisticated technology to coordinate activities across multiple regions weren't something local police felt equipped to handle. I was advised to stop accepting surveillance assignments and avoid further contact with the criminal operation. The officer suggested I might be called as a witness if they managed to build a case against the organizers, but warned me not to expect quick results given the complexity of the investigation. That advice would have been more useful if I hadn't already made myself a target by asking too many questions about the operation's broader activities. The criminals I'd been working for had been monitoring my access to their communication systems, and they'd noticed my sudden interest in properties I hadn't personally surveilled. I started receiving messages warning me to mind my own business and focus on my assigned surveillance work. The tone was polite but firm, making it clear that curiosity about the operation's wider activities wasn't appreciated. When I ignored these warnings and continued investigating what happened to the properties I documented, The messages became more explicit. I was told that people who caused problems for the operation had a tendency to experience problems of their own, and it would be unfortunate if I found myself in a similar situation. That's when I noticed I was being watched. Cars following me when I drove to surveillance assignments, people photographing me from across the street, even evidence that someone had been through my flat while I was out working. I found my own details posted on the same hidden communication system I'd been using to access the property listings. My home address, my daily routine, even a floor plan of my flat that someone had obviously sketched after gaining access while I was away. The message was clear. I was now a target myself, subject to the same surveillance and intelligence gathering I'd been conducting against others. They were demonstrating that they could reach me anywhere, that they knew intimate details about my life, and that I was just as vulnerable as the elderly couples and single parents I'd been helping them victimize. The surveillance escalated quickly after that. My flat was broken into while I was at the supermarket, though nothing was stolen. Someone wanted me to know they could access my home whenever they chose, that my locks and security measures meant nothing against people who had professional expertise in circumventing such protections. I started finding evidence of their intrusions everywhere. Personal belongings moved slightly out of position, computer files accessed and deleted, even photographs of me sleeping that had been left on my bedside table as a threat. The psychological impact was worse than any physical harm. I couldn't sleep knowing that strangers were entering my home while I was unconscious and vulnerable. I couldn't relax knowing that I was being watched and documented with the same systematic precision I'd applied to surveillance of others. I reported the break-ins to the police, but without evidence of theft or damage. They treated it as low-priority harassment rather than serious criminal activity. They suggested I improve my home security, apparently unaware that I was being targeted by professionals who could circumvent any reasonable security measures. That's when I realized I needed to leave Sheffield entirely. The surveillance operation knew where I lived, where I worked, even where I shopped and socialized. I couldn't escape their attention while remaining in a city where they had extensive resources and intelligence gathering capabilities. I packed essential belongings and drove to Glasgow to stay with my sister, leaving behind most of my possessions and my entire life in Sheffield. I told my sister I needed a change of scene after losing my job, not wanting to burden her with the truth about what I'd been involved with. But even here in Glasgow, several hundred miles from Sheffield, I don't feel entirely safe. The surveillance operation extends across the country, with operatives in every major city conducting reconnaissance work for criminals who treat home invasion as a professional enterprise. I keep checking the hidden communication system I still have access to, monitoring whether my details have been flagged for targeting by operatives in Scotland. So far, I haven't found any specific threats, but I know that could change at any moment. The worst part is knowing that the operation continues without me. Other desperate people are being recruited to conduct surveillance work, probably telling themselves the same lies I did about legitimate property assessment and overseas investors. The properties I documented are still being targeted for burglary and harassment. The elderly couples and vulnerable families I helped identify are still being victimized by criminals who use the intelligence I provided to plan their attacks. I keep thinking about that couple in Chapeltown who are too frightened to return to their own home after being burgled twice in a month. About the family in Meadowhall who sold their house at a loss because the harassment became unbearable. About all the other victims whose lives I helped destroy because I was too desperate for money to ask the obvious questions about what I was really doing. The surveillance operation has probably moved on to recruiting new operatives by now, finding other unemployed property professionals who are desperate enough to accept generous payment for documenting homes without asking why anyone would pay such rates for simple photography work. And somewhere in South Yorkshire, criminals are probably using the intelligence I gathered to plan their next burglary or harassment campaign, breaking into homes where elderly residents live alone, targeting families with young children, driving vulnerable people from their properties so the homes can be exploited for illegal purposes. I suppose I'm telling you this because I need someone to understand how these operations recruit ordinary people, how they exploit financial desperation to make us complicit in serious crimes, and how they're systematically destroying communities across the country. If you're ever approached with offers that seem too generous for simple work, if someone wants to pay you to photograph properties or gather information about residents, please walk away immediately. Don't make the same mistake I did by convincing yourself it's legitimate, because you need to believe it is. Because once you're involved with these operations, once you understand what they're really doing and who they're targeting, you can't unknow what you've learned. You become a liability they need to manage, a potential threat they need to monitor and control. And if you cause them enough problems, if you try to expose their activities or interfere with their operations, you might find yourself on the receiving end of the same surveillance and harassment you helped inflict on others. I'm living with that fear every day now, wondering if they've decided I'm enough of a threat to warrant more serious attention, wondering if the next property listing I see on their communication system will include my sister's address here in Glasgow. The operation taught me that privacy is an illusion, that home security means nothing against determined professionals, and that anyone can become a target if they threaten the wrong people's criminal enterprises. But most of all, it taught me that financial desperation can make you capable of things you never imagined you'd do, that the desire to pay your bills and keep your home can override your moral judgment until you're complicit in the systematic victimization of innocent people. I can't undo the damage I helped cause, can't restore the sense of security I helped destroy for dozens of families across South Yorkshire. All I can do is hope that someone with more resources and authority will eventually dismantle these operations before they destroy more communities and ruin more lives. And hope that my sister never asks why I jump every time I hear a car door close outside, or why I check the locks 3 times before going to bed, or why I can't seem to settle into normal life here in Glasgow, despite being several hundred miles from the people who turned me into both a criminal and a victim. I never imagined that looking for someone to share rent with could lead me to discover what people are actually willing to pay for when they think no one's watching. My original flatmate at Edinburgh University had dropped out halfway through second year, leaving me with a lease I couldn't afford on my own, and about 3 weeks to find someone to split the costs before I'd have to move back in with my parents in Aberdeen. Not exactly the independent student experience I'd been planning. The usual suspects: spare room, Facebook housing groups, university notice boards, weren't yielding much beyond time wasters and people whose idea of cleanliness clearly differed from mine. Desperation was setting in when someone on my course mentioned there were other places online where you could find flatmates, sites that weren't as mainstream, but often had better results because they catered to people with specific requirements. It made sense when she explained it. Some people needed flatmates who were okay with unusual working hours, pet ownership, or lifestyle choices that might not appeal to everyone. Specialized platforms could match people more effectively than generic room-sharing websites. I found the site she'd recommended through a series of links that took me progressively deeper into less familiar corners of the internet. The interface was basic but functional, with profiles that were much more detailed than typical flatmate finding platforms. Instead of just listing preferences about cleaning and noise levels, people described their living situations in comprehensive detail. Daily schedules, personal habits, even psychological profiles that seemed designed to ensure perfect compatibility between potential flatmates. The level of detail was impressive, if slightly overwhelming. Some profiles read more like dating site descriptions than housing arrangements, with extensive information about personality types, lifestyle preferences, and what they called arrangement parameters that weren't immediately clear. I created a profile that was honest but considerably less detailed than the examples I was seeing, focusing on basic information about my studies, the budget, and preferences for shared living space. Within hours, I'd received several responses from people interested in sharing accommodation. Most seemed normal enough, students and young professionals who needed housing in Edinburgh and were looking for reliable flatmates. But some responses included questions and suggestions that seemed oddly specific and personal. People wanting to know about my daily routine, social connections, and even family circumstances that weren't relevant to sharing rent and utilities. One particularly detailed response came from someone who seemed perfect on paper. Similar age, compatible schedule, excellent references from previous flatmates. But their message included extensive questions about my privacy, preferences, and comfort levels with various domestic arrangements. They wanted to know how I felt about having guests, whether I minded security cameras in common areas, and if I had any concerns about what they called alternative lifestyle choices that might occasionally be visible in shared spaces. The questions weren't necessarily inappropriate, but they had an intensity that seemed excessive for someone just looking for a straightforward flatmate arrangement. When I asked for clarification about what they meant by alternative lifestyle choices, the response was vague but reassuring. They explained that some people had hobbies or professional activities that required privacy and discretion, and they wanted to ensure potential flatmates would be comfortable with arrangements that provided adequate separation between personal and shared spaces. It seemed reasonable enough, and their financial credentials were solid. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop near the university to discuss the practical details of sharing the flat. The meeting went well initially. They were articulate and professional, asking sensible questions about lease terms and household responsibilities. But as the conversation continued, they began discussing the accommodation arrangement in ways that seemed to assume I understood implications that weren't obvious to me. References to discretion agreements and arrangement boundaries that would need to be established, along with mention of additional income opportunities that might be available through connections they could provide. When I asked for more specific information about these opportunities, they explained that sharing accommodation often led to networking possibilities and introductions to people who needed various services from reliable, discreet individuals. Nothing they said was explicitly concerning, but the combination of vague language and implied opportunities created an impression that the flatmate arrangement might involve more than just sharing rent and living space. I decided to research their background more thoroughly before making any commitments, using the personal details they'd provided to verify their identity and housing history. What I found was troubling. The name and references they'd given me didn't correspond to any verifiable identity or rental history. The professional credentials and educational background they'd described couldn't be confirmed through normal sources. More concerning was that the address they'd listed as their current accommodation was connected to properties that appeared in police reports and local news stories about disturbances, suspicious activities, and investigations into what were described as unconventional business operations. When I tried to research the flatmate finding platform itself more thoroughly, I discovered it wasn't just a housing website, but part of a larger system that facilitated various types of arrangements between people with specific requirements that couldn't be met through mainstream channels. Some profiles were clearly offering accommodation arrangements that involved much more than sharing domestic space. People seeking flatmates who would be willing to participate in activities that required discretion, or who could provide services that weren't advertised openly, but were implied through coded language. The detailed personal information being collected wasn't just for compatibility matching. It was for assessing people's suitability for involvement in activities that required particular psychological profiles and circumstances. I realized I'd been recruited not just as a potential flatmate, but as someone who might be willing to participate in arrangements that involve criminal or exploitative activities disguised as alternative lifestyle choices. The income opportunities that had been mentioned weren't legitimate employment, but payment for participating in activities that required people who were financially desperate and socially isolated enough to agree to things they wouldn't normally consider. But understanding what I'd stumbled across didn't provide clear guidance about how to extract myself safely from the situation. The people involved had already gathered detailed personal information about me and demonstrated sophisticated methods for concealing their actual activities and identities. Simply declining their flatmate offer might not be sufficient if they decided I posed a security risk because of what I'd learned about their recruitment methods. Meanwhile, the platform was probably continuing to target vulnerable students who were desperate for affordable accommodation and might be willing to compromise their safety and ethics in exchange for housing and income they couldn't obtain through legitimate channels. The flatmate search that should have been a straightforward housing arrangement had instead provided insight into systematic exploitation of students who were made vulnerable by financial pressures and housing insecurity. I never responded to any follow-up communications from potential flatmates I'd contacted through the platform, and eventually found accommodation through conventional university housing services despite the increased cost. But I remain concerned about other students who might be recruited through similar platforms, particularly those who are more desperate for housing and income than I'd been, and might be less able to recognize the warning signs of criminal recruitment disguised as accommodation opportunities. The detailed personal profiles and compatibility assessments were probably being used to identify students who could be gradually drawn into increasingly compromising arrangements, starting with housing that seemed legitimate but evolving into participation in activities that would be difficult to escape or report safely. When friends complained about difficulties finding affordable accommodation, I found myself unable to recommend alternative platforms without explaining how I discovered their connection to criminal recruitment, which would require admitting to activities I'd prefer to keep private. The housing crisis affecting students was creating vulnerabilities that were being systematically exploited by people who understood how to present criminal opportunities as legitimate solutions to accommodation and financial problems. Every time I saw flatmate advertisements that promised unusually good deals or mentioned alternative arrangements, I wondered whether students were being recruited for activities that went far beyond sharing rent and living space. The search for someone to help with accommodation costs had instead revealed how easily desperate circumstances could be exploited by people who specialized in identifying and manipulating vulnerable individuals through offers that seemed too good to question until it was too late to withdraw safely. I suppose I should have known something was wrong when they paid me £50 just to watch adverts and give my opinion. That's not the sort of money market research companies usually throw around. especially not for someone like me, who'd never done anything more exciting than work behind the till at a corner shop in Wolverhampton. But when you're barely scraping by and someone offers you easy money for sitting in a room and talking about what you think of washing powder commercials, you don't ask too many questions. The invitation came through the post, which was unusual enough on its own. Most market research these days happens online or through phone calls, but this was a proper printed letter with my name and address typed on expensive-looking paper. The letter explained that I'd been selected to participate in an exclusive consumer research study examining how people respond to different types of advertising. They wanted participants between 25 and 45 who worked in retail or service industries and lived in the West Midlands area. The study would involve watching various advertisements and discussing my reactions with other participants, along with some individual interviews about my shopping habits and media consumption. The location was given as a business centre in Birmingham city centre, which seemed legitimate enough. The letter provided a phone number to confirm attendance and mentioned that participants would receive compensation for their time and travel expenses. I called the number and spoke to a woman who sounded professional and knowledgeable about market research procedures. She confirmed the details from the letter and asked some basic questions about my background to ensure I fit their target demographic. The conversation was routine and businesslike, exactly what I'd expect from a legitimate research company. The business centre was easy enough to find, located in a modern office building near the Bull Ring. The reception area looked professional, with branded materials for various companies and a steady flow of people coming and going for different meetings and appointments. I was directed to a conference room on the 3rd floor, where about a dozen other people were already waiting. The group seemed to match the demographic they'd described, mostly people in their 30s and 40s who looked like they worked in shops, restaurants, or other service jobs around the West Midlands. The session began with a researcher introducing herself and explaining that we'd be viewing a series of advertisements for various consumer products. Our task was to watch each advert carefully and then discuss our reactions, focusing on what we found appealing, confusing, or memorable about the marketing messages. The first few advertisements were exactly what I'd expected. Typical commercial spots for household products, food brands, and retail chains. The discussion afterward was straightforward, with participants sharing their opinions about the effectiveness of different marketing approaches and whether the adverts would influence their purchasing decisions. However, as the session progressed, the advertisements became increasingly unusual. Instead of polished commercial spots from recognizable brands, we began viewing what appeared to be amateur or experimental marketing materials for products and services I'd never heard of. Some of these advertisements were for websites and online services that seemed to operate outside normal commercial channels. The marketing materials emphasized privacy, discretion, and access to exclusive content or services that weren't available through conventional retailers or service providers. The researcher seemed particularly interested in our reactions to these unusual advertisements. She asked detailed questions about whether we found the marketing messages compelling, whether we would be interested in learning more about the services advertised, and what factors would influence our decision to engage with unconventional online businesses. During the individual interviews that followed the group discussion, the questions became more personal and specific. The researcher wanted to know about my financial situation, my online activities, and my attitudes toward privacy and security when using internet services. She also asked about my social relationships and support systems, probing into whether I lived alone, how often I communicated with family and friends, and whether I had people in my life who might notice if my behavior or circumstances changed significantly. These questions felt intrusive and irrelevant to market research about advertising effectiveness. When I mentioned feeling uncomfortable with the personal nature of the inquiries, the researcher explained that understanding consumer psychology required comprehensive knowledge of people's life circumstances and decision-making processes. She assured me that all information would be kept strictly confidential and used only for legitimate research purposes. The personal questions were necessary to understand how different life situations influence people's responses to various types of marketing messages. The session concluded with the researcher providing contact information for follow-up research opportunities. She mentioned that participants who provided detailed and thoughtful responses would be invited to participate in additional studies that offered higher compensation for more specialized research activities. I received the promised payment in cash as I left the building, along with a business card containing contact information for future research opportunities. The entire experience had been professional and well organized, despite my discomfort with some of the more personal questions. About a week later, I received a phone call inviting me to participate in a follow-up study that would involve testing online services and providing feedback about user experience and interface design. The compensation offered was substantially higher than the first session, and the work could be completed from home on my own schedule. The caller explained that the research involved evaluating websites and online platforms that were still in development stages. I would be given access to these experimental services and asked to document my experiences using them, focusing on usability, functionality, and overall user satisfaction. This seemed like a natural progression from the advertising research, and the higher pay was attractive enough to override my lingering concerns about the personal questions from the first session. I agreed to participate and was provided with detailed instructions for accessing the experimental websites. The instructions included steps for downloading specialized software that would allow me to access websites that weren't available through normal internet browsing. The researcher explained that many experimental online services operated on private networks to protect their development work from competitors and unauthorized access. The software installation process was more complex than typical internet applications, requiring specific security settings and network configurations that seemed unusual for basic website testing. When I asked about these requirements, the researcher explained that experimental services often required enhanced security measures to protect proprietary technology and user data. Once the software was properly configured, I gained access to a collection of websites and online platforms that were unlike anything I'd encountered through normal internet use. These services offered various types of content and functionality, but many seemed to operate outside the boundaries of conventional online businesses. Some platforms provided access to information and services that were explicitly described as being unavailable through mainstream internet channels. Others offered opportunities to participate in activities or transactions that required significant discretion and anonymity from users. The research tasks involved exploring these platforms thoroughly and documenting my experiences using detailed questionnaires and feedback forms. I was asked to evaluate not just the technical functionality of the services, but also my emotional and psychological responses to the content and activities available. Many of the questions focused on whether I found the services exciting, whether I would recommend them to others, and what factors would influence my decision to become a regular user of these types of platforms. As I spent more time exploring the experimental websites, I began to understand that they were providing access to areas of the internet that most people never encounter. The content and services available through these platforms included activities that were clearly illegal or designed to exploit vulnerable people. Some websites offered detailed instructions for various criminal activities, while others provided marketplaces for goods and services that couldn't be obtained through legitimate channels. Many platforms seemed designed to facilitate interactions between people seeking to engage in harmful or exploitative activities. The realization that I was being asked to evaluate and provide feedback on criminal websites was deeply disturbing. The market research study had been used to recruit people who could be trusted to access illegal online services and provide intelligence about their usability and appeal. When I tried to contact the research company to express my concerns, I discovered that the phone numbers and contact information I'd been given were no longer working. The business address led to an office building that had no record of the research company I'd been working with. I also began noticing signs that my online activities were being monitored more extensively than would be necessary for legitimate market research. My internet usage, email communications, and even my location seemed to be tracked and documented by unknown parties. The specialized software I'd installed to access the experimental websites had apparently provided comprehensive surveillance capabilities that extended far beyond the research tasks I'd been asked to complete. My computer and internet connection had been compromised to allow ongoing monitoring of my personal activities. When I attempted to remove the research software and end my participation in the study, I discovered that the monitoring capabilities couldn't be easily disabled. The software had integrated itself into my computer systems in ways that made complete removal extremely difficult without professional technical assistance. I also received messages suggesting that my participation in the research had provided me with access to sensitive information about illegal online services. The implication was that my knowledge of these criminal platforms made me a potential security risk that required ongoing monitoring and management. The messages reminded me that I had detailed knowledge of how to access and use illegal websites, and that this information could be valuable to law enforcement or competing criminal organizations. My safety and legal protection depended on maintaining discretion about everything I had learned during the research process. I realized that the market research study had been designed to identify and recruit people who could be manipulated into accessing illegal online services while providing detailed intelligence about their operations and user base. The focus group had been a screening process to identify vulnerable individuals who could be trusted with criminal activities. The personal questions during the interviews had been used to assess my psychological profile and determine whether I could be controlled through financial pressure, social isolation, or other forms of manipulation. The research company had been evaluating my suitability as an unwitting participant in criminal online activities. The ongoing surveillance of my personal activities was probably being used to gather leverage that could ensure my continued cooperation with illegal activities, or my silence about criminal operations I had been exposed to during the research process. I never determined who was actually behind the research study or what they ultimately intended to do with the intelligence I had provided about illegal online services. The combination of sophisticated recruitment methods, comprehensive surveillance capabilities, and systematic exposure to criminal activities suggested an organization with significant resources and expertise. What I understand now is that they had developed effective methods for identifying and recruiting unwitting participants in criminal online activities by presenting illegal research as legitimate market research opportunities. They understood how to exploit people's financial needs and curiosity about technology to recruit accomplices for activities they would never willingly participate in. The most disturbing aspect of this experience was how my desire for additional income had been transformed into participation in the evaluation and improvement of criminal online services. The market research had been a recruitment method designed to identify people who could be manipulated into providing intelligence about illegal activities while believing they were conducting legitimate consumer research. I still receive occasional contact attempts from similar market research companies, offering compensation for participation in studies that involve evaluating experimental online services and technologies. The studies they describe always offer unusually high compensation, always involve accessing specialized websites, and always require comprehensive confidentiality about the research process. I decline these opportunities immediately now, but I wonder how many other people have found themselves in similar situations, believing they are participating in legitimate market research, while actually providing intelligence and feedback that helps improve criminal online operations targeting vulnerable users. I need to tell someone about this, even if no one believes me, even if it sounds completely mad. I've carried it around for 18 months now, and the weight of it is destroying me. Every time I see a missing person poster, every time there's a news story about someone who's vanished, I wonder if they found the same thing I did, if they're gone because of it. I was living in Norwich then, working as a dental hygienist. My life was predictable in that comfortable way that makes you feel safe but slightly dead inside. Same patients every 6 months, same conversations about flossing, same walk home along the river. I'd been single for about 2 years after a relationship that ended badly, and I'd gotten used to my own company, maybe too used to it. The dark web wasn't something I'd ever planned to explore, but after a documentary about online privacy, I got curious about what was actually on there. Spent a weekend learning how to access it safely, or as safely as you can access something inherently unsafe. I expected drugs, weapons, all the stuff you hear about. What I found was mostly just boring. Dead sites, broken links, things written in languages I didn't understand. But then I found something called the service. It was just a simple page with a search bar. No explanation, no about section, nothing to indicate what you were supposed to search for. I tried a few random words. Nothing came up. Tried some names of celebrities, thinking maybe it was one of those sites that leaked personal information. Still nothing. Then, out of boredom more than anything, I typed in my own name. One result appeared. A link with just my name and a string of numbers after it. My finger hovered over the mouse for a long time before I clicked it. The page that loaded was bizarrely mundane. It looked like a basic profile. My name, my age, my address in Norwich, a recent photo that looked like it had been taken on the street without my knowledge, my place of work, my regular coffee shop, the gym I'd just joined but barely used, even my bloody Netflix viewing history somehow. Below all this information was a single line of text. Service available. There was a button next to it. Submit request. I should have closed it immediately. Should have shut the laptop and pretended I'd never seen it. But there was something so specifically threatening about that phrase. Service available. What service? Available to whom? I went back and searched other names. People I knew. My ex-boyfriend came up. Same format. Personal details, recent photo, that same line about service being available. My colleague, Rachel. My neighbor from 2 doors down. My cousin in Sheffield. Everyone I searched for had a profile. But not everyone had service available written on theirs. Some said service in progress. Others said service complete. Rachel said service complete. This bothered me because Rachel had been acting strange lately. She'd called in sick for 2 weeks, then come back seeming different, jumpy, kept checking her phone. Wouldn't eat lunch with us anymore, just sat in her car. I'd assumed she was going through something personal. I searched for more names, people I knew less well. The man who ran the corner shop near my flat, service in progress. A woman from my gym who'd suddenly stopped coming, service complete. My previous neighbor who'd moved away very suddenly last year, service complete. A pattern was forming that made my hands shake as I typed. I went back to my own profile and really studied it this time. The photo was recent, maybe 2 or 3 weeks old. I was wearing the new coat I'd bought in October. The information was current too, including the gym I'd only joined the previous month. Someone was keeping this updated. Below the submit request button, in tiny text I'd missed before, was a link that said view completed services. I clicked it. It was a gallery of some kind. Hundreds of profiles, but these were different. Each one had before and after sections. The before showed people like my profile, normal information, recent photos, daily routines. The after sections were what made me run to the bathroom to be sick. Some showed people who'd clearly been beaten, bruised faces, broken bones, fear in their eyes. Others showed people in what looked like captivity. Basement rooms, mattresses on floors, chains. But the worst ones, the ones that haunt me, were the ones that showed nothing. Just the word relocated under the after section. I recognized some faces. People from Norwich who'd gone missing over the past few years. A teenager who'd vanished walking home from school. A man who'd left for work and never arrived. They were all here, all marked as service complete. I went back to Rachel's profile with growing dread. Her after section showed her in what looked like a warehouse, sitting on a chair, staring at nothing. The photo was dated 2 weeks ago when she'd been off sick, but she was back at work now. She was fine, wasn't she? The next day at work, I couldn't stop watching her. She seemed normal enough, if quieter than usual. But then I noticed something, a small scar on her neck that hadn't been there before. The way she flinched when anyone walked behind her, how she kept touching her wrist, like checking something was still there. During lunch, when she went to her car as usual, I followed. Watched from a distance as she sat in the driver's seat, not eating, not looking at her phone, just sitting. Then I saw her sleeve ride up. Bruises, dark ones, the kind that come from being held down. I wanted to talk to her, ask if she was okay, but how could I? How could I explain what I knew without admitting I'd been looking at her profile on some horrific, dark website? That night, I went back to the service. I needed to understand what this was, who was running it, what the submit request button actually did. This time, I noticed something new, a small counter in the corner of the main page. Active services, 47. I refreshed the page. Active services, 48. Someone, somewhere, had just submitted a request. I searched frantically through profiles of people I knew, looking for who'd just been marked. Found him after 20 minutes of searching. My ex-boyfriend's best friend, someone who'd always hated me, blamed me for the breakup. His status had changed from service available to service in progress. 3 days later, he was in the hospital. Supposedly a mugging gone wrong, but nothing was stolen. Both his legs were broken. He couldn't remember what happened, just waking up in an alley behind his flat. I checked the service. His status, service complete. That's when I understood. This wasn't just surveillance or stalking. This was a marketplace for violence. Submit a request on someone and something would happen to them. Beating, kidnapping, worse. All presented like ordering a pizza online. I tried to find out more about how it worked. Who was doing the actual violence? How people even knew this site existed. But the deeper I dug, the more frightened I became, because I started recognizing patterns in the completed services. The man who ran the corner shop, His completed service corresponded with his competition, another shop owner 3 streets over, having their status changed to service available the same day. Like it was payment, the woman from my gym, her ex-husband's status, had changed to service available the day after hers went to complete. It was a trade. Do something to someone, and you earned the right to have something done to someone else. I stopped sleeping, stopped going to work, just sat in my flat refreshing the service, watching the counter go up. Active services, 52, 53, 54. Then my own status changed. Service in progress. I ran. Packed nothing, just got in my car and drove. Stayed in different hotels every night, paid cash for everything, threw away my phone. But I couldn't resist checking the service from internet cafes. My status stayed the same for 2 weeks. Service in progress. Then, nothing. It went back to service available, like someone had cancelled the request. Or maybe they just couldn't find me. I've never been back to Norwich. I live in Scotland now. Different name, different job, always looking over my shoulder. I check the service sometimes when I can't help myself. It's still there, still active. The counter keeps going up. My old profile is still there too, with my Norwich address, my old job, photos from 2 years ago. Service available. But there's a new profile now, with my new name, my Scottish address, a photo from last month. Service available. I've thought about going to the police so many times, but with what evidence? Screenshots from an illegal website, stories about people I can't prove are connected, and more importantly, if the service is real, if there really are people out there fulfilling these requests, what happens if I become too much of a problem? There's something else I haven't told anyone. Last month, I saw my sister's profile appear for the first time. She lives in Bristol, has 2 kids, a normal life. Her status, service available, and right below it, that button. Submit request. Sometimes, late at night, I think about it, about who marked me, who wanted something done to me badly enough to do something to someone else first. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I think about my sister's profile, about how easy it would be to click that button, about who I'd have to hurt to keep her safe. The service is still there, still growing. Every day, more profiles, more services in progress, more people who have no idea they're on a list, available for violence at the click of a button. Every missing person, every unexplained assault, every sudden disappearance. I wonder if they're part of it. I wonder how many people know about it. How many have used it? How many have traded violence for violence, hurt for hurt? And I wonder when my status will change again. When someone, somewhere, will decide I'm worth the trade. When service in progress will appear next to my name again. Only this time, I might not see it coming. I should probably mention up front that I've always been terrible at keeping secrets, so writing this down feels like a massive mistake, but I need to get it out of my head somehow. The whole thing started when my mum called me at university in Newcastle, worried because she hadn't heard from my gran in over a week. Gran lived alone in a little terraced house in Sunderland and usually phoned every few days, but she'd gone completely silent. Mum was stuck at work and couldn't drive up to check on her until the weekend, so she asked if I could pop round after lectures. It seemed like a simple enough favour. Just knock on the door, make sure Gran was all right. Maybe stay for a cup of tea and listen to her complain about the neighbours. The sort of family obligation that takes an hour out of your day and makes everyone feel better. But when I got to Grand Street that Thursday afternoon, her house was completely dark, and there was a pile of uncollected posts behind the front door. I rang the bell and knocked repeatedly, but got no response. The curtains were drawn tight, and I couldn't see any signs of life inside. I was starting to worry that something serious had happened when I noticed a man watching me from across the street. He was standing by a white van, pretending to check his phone, but clearly keeping an eye on what I was doing at Gran's house. When I looked directly at him, he walked over and introduced himself as someone from the council's Adult Social Services Department. He explained that they'd received reports about an elderly resident who might need assistance, and he was there to conduct a welfare check. The timing seemed like more than coincidence. I just arrived to check on my Gran, and a social worker happened to be doing the same thing at exactly the same moment. But his identification looked legitimate, and he seemed genuinely concerned about Gran's well-being. He suggested we try to gain entry together to make sure she was safe. He had protocols for accessing properties when there were genuine welfare concerns, and my presence as a family member would help ensure everything was done properly. That should have been when I insisted on calling my mum first, or asked to see more formal identification, or just walked away entirely. But I was genuinely worried about Gran, and this seemed like the fastest way to find out if she was all right. The social worker had tools for gaining entry without causing damage, and within a few minutes, we were inside Gran's house. It was immediately obvious that she hadn't been home for several days. Stale air, unopened mail, food going off in the kitchen, but the house didn't show signs of any emergency or struggle. Gran's belongings were all in their normal places. Her medication was still in the bathroom cabinet, and there were no obvious indications of what might have happened to her. The social worker seemed particularly interested in Gran's personal documents and financial paperwork. He spent considerable time looking through drawers and filing cabinets, claiming he needed to check for information about her care arrangements or emergency contacts. He also took detailed photographs of different rooms, explaining that documentation was required for welfare check reports and that the images would help other professionals assess Gran's living situation and support needs. Something about his behavior was starting to make me uncomfortable, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly what seemed wrong. He was thorough and professional, asking appropriate questions about Gran's routine and health concerns. But he was also gathering much more information than seemed necessary for a basic welfare check. Personal financial documents, details about her daily schedule, even observations about security arrangements and valuable items in the house. When I suggested that we should contact police about Gran's apparent disappearance, the social worker discouraged immediate reporting. He explained that elderly people often made unexpected changes to their routines, and that filing missing person reports prematurely could cause unnecessary alarm and waste police resources. He suggested waiting another day or two to see if Gran returned home naturally, while he conducted follow-up inquiries through official channels that might locate her more efficiently than police investigations. That advice seemed reasonable at the time, but looking back, it was probably designed to delay any official involvement in Gran's disappearance while giving him time to complete whatever he was really doing in her house. I left that afternoon thinking I'd done everything possible to check on Gran's safety and that proper authorities were handling the situation through appropriate channels. But over the next few days, I started having doubts about the encounter. When I tried to contact the Social Services Department to follow up on their welfare check, I couldn't find any record of the officer I'd met or any scheduled visits to Gran's address. The phone number on the identification he'd shown me led to a generic voicemail system that didn't identify any specific department or organization. When I tried to report my concerns to the main council office, they had no knowledge of any welfare checks being conducted in Gran's area. I realized that the man I'd helped gain entry to Gran's house probably wasn't a legitimate social worker at all. I'd assisted a stranger in conducting what was essentially a burglary, providing family authorization for someone to access property and information they had no right to examine. But understanding that I'd been deceived didn't immediately clarify what had actually happened to Gran, or why someone had wanted access to her house and personal documents. When I finally convinced my mum to report Gran as missing, the police investigation revealed that she'd been admitted to hospital several days earlier after collapsing while out shopping. When she was found, she had been unconscious and had no identification with her, which prevented the hospital from contacting her family members immediately. Gran was recovering well, but the timing meant that her house had been empty and vulnerable during exactly the period when the fake social worker had gained access with my unwitting assistance. Someone had been monitoring Gran's situation carefully enough to know when she'd be absent from her home, and had used that opportunity to conduct systematic search of her property while maintaining the pretense of official welfare concern. The detailed photographs and personal information gathering suggested they'd been looking for specific items or intelligence rather than just conducting a random burglary. They'd wanted access to Gran's financial records, personal documents, and security arrangements for reasons that went beyond simple theft. When I tried to research whether other elderly people in the area had experienced similar fake welfare checks, I found scattered reports of supposed social workers and health visitors who had gained access to properties under false pretenses. Most victims had been elderly people living alone who were dealing with health problems or family concerns that made them vulnerable to official-sounding offers of assistance and support. The fake officials were systematic and professional, using legitimate-looking identification and appropriate terminology to convince both elderly residents and family members that their visits were authorized and necessary. But the real purpose seemed to be gathering intelligence about elderly people's circumstances, financial situations, and security arrangements that could be used for subsequent criminal targeting. The operation was sophisticated enough to coordinate monitoring of individual elderly people, timing of fake welfare visits, and recruitment of unwitting accomplices like family members who could provide legitimate-seeming authorization for property access. I'd been used as cover for what was essentially organized reconnaissance against my own grandmother, providing the family presence needed to make the fake welfare check appear legitimate and authorized. But the most disturbing aspect was realizing that this was probably happening to elderly people across the region, with fake officials systematically gathering intelligence about vulnerable individuals who could be targeted for various forms of exploitation. The criminals were using people's genuine concern for elderly relatives to facilitate their own access to properties and personal information, turning family care instincts into tools for criminal targeting. Meanwhile, the intelligence they'd gathered from Gran's house was probably being used to plan future crimes against her, or being sold to other criminals who specialized in targeting elderly victims with specific vulnerabilities. I'd inadvertently provided criminals with everything they needed to systematically exploit my grandmother while thinking I was helping ensure her safety and well-being. The fake welfare check had been so convincing that I'd never questioned whether the man's authority was legitimate, and by the time I realized I'd been deceived, the damage was already done. Gran recovered fully from her hospital stay, but I never told her or my mum about the fake social worker I'd helped gain access to her house. The knowledge that I'd facilitated what was essentially preparation for crimes against my own grandmother was too disturbing to share with family members who trusted me to protect rather than endanger her. But I remain concerned about what use might eventually be made of the intelligence that had been gathered about Gran's circumstances, and whether the fake welfare check operation was continuing to target other elderly people whose families could be manipulated into providing unwitting assistance for criminal reconnaissance. The guilt about my role in facilitating the fake welfare check was compounded by the realization that I probably wouldn't recognize similar deception if it happened again, and that my willingness to trust official seeming authority could be exploited to harm people I cared about. When Gran mentioned a few weeks later that she'd been receiving unusually persistent calls from companies offering home security services, financial advice, and healthcare products, I knew the intelligence gathered during the fake welfare check was already being used to target her for various forms of exploitation. My brother Danny used to collect coincidences, not deliberately. He just had this habit of pointing out when things lined up in ways that seemed too convenient to be random, like when his favorite band announced a concert on his birthday, or when the book he needed for a school project turned up in a charity shop the same day he got the assignment. He'd get this look on his face, half suspicious and half delighted, as if he'd caught the universe playing a trick on him. I've never been the type to believe in coincidences, but I am now. I've learned that sometimes what looks like pure chance is actually something much more deliberate, much more planned than you could ever imagine. And sometimes curiosity about the wrong thing can make you part of someone else's design without you ever realizing it. This is about my younger brother Danny. He was 15 when it happened. The kind of lad who spent most of his time online, but wasn't particularly tech-savvy. Just a normal teenager who played games, watched videos, and got into arguments on forums about things that didn't really matter. He lived with our mum in Nottingham after our parents split, and I'd see him every other weekend when he'd come to stay with me in Sheffield. He was always curious about things he wasn't supposed to know about. Not in a rebellious way. He just wanted to understand how the world actually worked. The trouble started when he read something online about hidden parts of the internet where you could find things that weren't available on normal websites, not just pirated content, but genuinely disturbing material that existed in spaces most people never knew about. During the summer holidays, he started researching these hidden networks, following links from one forum to another, slowly building an understanding of how to access parts of the internet that required special software. His first attempts were unsuccessful, mostly leading to dead links, but he persisted with that teenage conviction that there were secrets being kept from him. When he finally managed to access these hidden networks, most of what he found was disappointing. Defunct marketplaces, conspiracy forums, websites selling things he had no interest in. But he kept exploring, going deeper into increasingly obscure corners. The content became progressively stranger and more disturbing, moving from simple illegality into areas that made him genuinely uncomfortable. Yet something compelled him to continue. The breakthrough came when he found a forum dedicated to discussing live content. Users shared links and recommendations with the casual tone of people discussing television programs, rating what they'd seen, and making requests for specific types of content. Reading through these discussions, he began to understand that what he'd initially dismissed as internet mythology might actually exist. The sites themselves were primitive but functional. Basic interfaces, poor video quality, minimal features, but they worked well enough to stream content that was clearly authentic rather than professionally produced fiction. What he found most unsettling was how organized it all seemed despite the amateur presentation. There were schedules, regular programming, someone coordinating activities across multiple streams. The forums contained discussions about how participants were recruited and managed. The process seemed to start with identifying vulnerable individuals through social media and gaming platforms, gradually building trust before making direct contact. Reading these discussions made him increasingly uncomfortable, but also more fascinated. Part of him knew he should stop, that he was seeing things no 15-year-old should see, but another part couldn't look away. What really caught his attention were the references to operations in the UK. Users shared information about potential targets and opportunities across different regions, including areas he recognized. The discussions about recruitment were particularly detailed. Users traded advice on social media monitoring, techniques for initiating contact, methods for gradually escalating involvement. He started noticing patterns in his own online activities that matched what he'd read about target identification. Gaming platforms, where he'd made friends with people he'd never met. Social media interactions with accounts that seemed designed to gather personal information, and messages from users who showed unusual interest in his daily routine and family situation. The realization that he might have accidentally identified himself as a potential target was genuinely frightening. His exploration of these networks would have left digital traces. His interest in the content would have been noted, and his online behavior would have been analyzed for vulnerabilities. By investigating their world, he'd made himself visible to people who specialized in exploitation. The direct contact began through private messages on one of the forums. Someone had been observing his posts and wanted to share more exclusive content that wasn't available in the public areas. The approach was gradual and friendly, presenting the interaction as a privilege rather than something that should raise suspicion. For a moment, he hesitated. Something about the message felt too convenient, too perfectly timed. But curiosity won out over caution, as it always seemed to with him. The private content was significantly more disturbing than what he'd seen in the open forums. Higher production values, more organized presentation, material that suggested the operators had serious resources and locations. Over several weeks, the private conversations became more personal. His contact showed interest in his life, his location, his family situation, and his daily routines. The questions were subtle and spread across multiple conversations, but collectively they built a detailed picture of his circumstances and vulnerabilities. The turning point came when his contact offered to arrange a meeting. Not dramatic or obviously threatening, just a suggestion that he might be interested in seeing how these operations actually worked, perhaps even contributing in some way. The proposal was presented as an opportunity rather than a demand, something that should feel exciting rather than dangerous. By this point, his judgment seemed completely compromised. The weeks of exposure to increasingly extreme content had normalized things that should have been immediately recognized as dangerous. His contact had skillfully managed the progression from curious observer to potential participant, using techniques that had clearly been refined through experience. The meeting was arranged for a weekend when he was supposed to be staying with me in Sheffield. Instead of taking the usual train, he was to meet his contact at a service station just outside Nottingham. The location was public enough to feel safe but isolated enough for privacy. Exactly the sort of place that would appear in the recruitment discussions he'd read. I didn't know any of this was happening. As far as I was concerned, he was coming to stay as usual, maybe arriving a bit later than normal, but nothing that seemed worth questioning. Our mum dropped him at the train station that Saturday morning, and we expected him to arrive in Sheffield by early afternoon. When he didn't turn up, we initially assumed he'd missed his connection or decided to meet friends instead. Teenagers don't always follow plans exactly, and he wasn't particularly reliable about keeping people informed of his movements. It wasn't until evening that we started to worry seriously. The police were helpful but not particularly concerned at first. A 15-year-old missing for less than 24 hours wasn't unusual, especially during school holidays when kids often made spontaneous plans with friends. They took details and assured us they'd investigate, but their tone suggested this would resolve itself quickly. His phone was switched off, his social media accounts showed no recent activity, and none of his friends had heard from him since the previous evening. The complete silence was unusual for someone who normally maintained constant online contact with various people throughout the day. The investigation revealed that he'd never boarded the train to Sheffield. CCTV from the station showed him leaving the building shortly after our mum had dropped him off, walking towards the car park rather than the platforms. After that, the trail went cold completely. Police found his online activities eventually, but understanding what they meant required technical expertise that took time to arrange. By the time they'd pieced together his exploration of hidden networks and identified his contact, weeks had passed and any physical evidence had long since disappeared. The forums he'd been using went offline shortly after his disappearance. Not just the specific sites he'd visited, but entire sections of the network seemed to shut down and relocate. Whether this was coincidental timing or a deliberate response to increased attention was impossible to determine. His contact's identity proved impossible to trace. The account had been carefully constructed to avoid revealing any genuine personal information, using technical methods that made investigation extremely difficult. The conversations they'd had contained no references to real locations or identifiable details. 6 months later, we're still waiting for answers that will probably never come. His disappearance has been classified as suspected abduction, but there's no evidence of who might be responsible or where he might have been taken. Sometimes I wonder if his curiosity was genuinely random, or if he was deliberately guided towards those networks by people who were already watching for suitable targets. The coincidence of him discovering exactly the right forums, connecting with exactly the right person, and being offered exactly the opportunity that would appeal to his personality seems almost too convenient to be accidental. I think about the techniques they described for identifying and approaching targets, the systematic way they built trust before making their move. Everything that happened to him followed patterns that were discussed openly in those forums, as if his entire experience was just another implementation of proven methods. His initial discovery might not have been accidental at all. His online activities could have been monitored and guided. His curiosity deliberately cultivated by people who specialized in recruiting vulnerable individuals. That's why I believe in coincidence now. Not because things happen randomly, but because recognizing patterns helps you see when they might be something more deliberate. Danny used to collect coincidences like they were treasures. Now I wonder if he became one himself. I wish I'd thrown that recipe card away the moment I realized it wasn't for anything you'd actually want to eat. It was tucked inside a cookbook I'd bought from a charity shop, one of those massive family recipe collections from the 1970s that promised to feed a household for about 50 pence per meal. Perfect for a student budget, and exactly the sort of thing you'd expect to find in a help-the-aged shop for a couple of quid. The recipe card was handwritten on proper index cardstock, the kind people used before everything went digital. Someone had taken real care with it, writing out ingredients and instructions in neat handwriting that looked like it belonged to someone who took cooking seriously. But the recipe itself was strange. It was for something called compliance cookies, which wasn't a name I recognized, and the ingredient list included items that definitely weren't meant for baking. Things like pharmaceutical compounds with complex chemical names, and instructions for precise measurements that seemed more suited to a laboratory than a kitchen. At first, I assumed it was someone's idea of a joke recipe, or maybe notes from a chemistry student who'd been using recipe cards for study materials. But the more I looked at it, the more detailed and professional it appeared. The instructions weren't written like a joke. They included specific timing requirements, temperature controls, and even warnings about handling certain ingredients safely. Someone had clearly tested this recipe multiple times and refined the process based on actual results. Most concerning were the notes written in the margins about dosage calculations based on body weight and expected effects on different types of people. These weren't cooking notes. They were instructions for administering controlled substances to unwitting victims through food. I tried to research some of the chemical compounds mentioned in the recipe and found that several were pharmaceutical drugs that could cause serious behavioral changes if consumed without medical supervision. Others appeared to be industrial chemicals that had no legitimate use in food preparation. The recipe was essentially a guide for drugging people without their knowledge or consent, disguised as baking instructions that could be easily overlooked or dismissed as harmless cooking experiments. But finding this recipe card raised disturbing questions about who had created it and what they'd been planning to do with these so-called compliance cookies. I decided to look more carefully through the cookbook to see if there were other unusual recipe cards or notes that might provide context for what I'd discovered. What I found were several more handwritten cards tucked between pages, all containing similar recipes for foods and drinks that included pharmaceutical or chemical additives designed to affect people's behavior or cognitive function. Someone had been systematically developing methods for administering various drugs through normal food and beverages, with detailed instructions for preparation and dosage that suggested extensive testing and refinement. The recipes covered everything from mild sedatives that could make people compliant and suggestible, to more serious compounds that could cause unconsciousness or memory problems that would prevent victims from recalling what had happened to them. But most disturbing was that these weren't theoretical experiments. The margin notes included observations about how different people had responded to various formulations, with adjustments made based on real-world testing of these dangerous recipes. Someone had been using these recipes to drug actual people, documenting the results and continuously improving their methods based on observed effects on unwitting victims. I was holding evidence of systematic poisoning that had probably been used to facilitate serious crimes against people who had no idea they were being chemically incapacitated. When I tried to research whether similar recipe cards or instruction sets were available through other sources, I found myself following links to hidden websites that specialized in providing exactly this type of criminal instruction. The sites contained extensive libraries of recipes and techniques for administering various drugs through food and drinks, with detailed information about sources for ingredients, preparation methods, and strategies for avoiding detection. The communities using these sites shared experiences and improvements, treating systematic poisoning as a collaborative hobby where people could learn from each other's successes and mistakes. But most shocking was discovering that the charity shop cookbook wasn't an isolated case. These recipe collections were deliberately distributed through second-hand bookshops, charity sales, and other channels where they could be discovered by people who might be interested in their contents. The recipes were being spread systematically, with experienced practitioners using anonymous distribution methods to share their techniques with potential new users who were seeking ways to gain control over other people through chemical means. I realized that charity shops and second-hand bookstores were being used as distribution networks for criminal instruction materials, with dangerous recipe collections hidden among normal cooking books. where they could be found by people looking for exactly this type of information. But the casual way these materials were being distributed suggested that systematic drugging was much more common than I'd ever imagined, with established communities of people who regularly use these techniques against unsuspecting victims. The professional quality and extensive testing notes indicated that these weren't amateur experiments, but refined criminal methods that had been developed and perfected through extensive real-world application. People were being systematically drugged in restaurants, social situations, and domestic environments by individuals who had access to detailed instructions for chemical incapacitation that had been tested and proven effective against unwitting victims. But proving the criminal nature of these recipe cards would be complicated, since they were presented as unusual cooking instructions rather than explicit guides for drugging people. The chemical compounds mentioned in the recipes could potentially have legitimate uses, and the format made them appear like eccentric culinary experiments rather than systematic poisoning instructions. Meanwhile, the distribution system was probably continuing to spread these dangerous recipes through charity shops and second-hand bookstores, making them available to anyone who was looking for methods to chemically control other people. The recipe cards I'd found were just a small sample of criminal instruction materials that were being circulated through channels that appeared completely innocent and legitimate. But the most troubling realization was that the people creating and distributing these recipes were probably still active, continuing to develop new methods and test them on unwitting victims who would never realize they'd been systematically poisoned. The extensive margin notes and refinement instructions suggested ongoing criminal activity that was being documented and shared to help other people become more effective at drugging their intended targets. I never reported the recipe cards to police, partly because explaining how I'd found them would be difficult, and partly because the evidence was ambiguous enough that prosecution would be challenging without specific victims or witnessed crimes. But I remained disturbed by the knowledge that systematic poisoning instructions were being casually distributed through second-hand book channels, and that the people responsible were probably continuing to refine and share their techniques with growing communities of individuals who used chemical incapacitation as a regular method for controlling others. The cookbook I'd bought for student budget meal planning had instead provided insight into criminal activities that were probably happening much more frequently than anyone realized, with victims who would never understand why they'd experience unexplained drowsiness, memory problems, or behavioral changes in social situations where they should have felt safe. Every time I ate food prepared by other people or accepted drinks in social situations, I found myself wondering whether I was consuming something that contained more than the listed ingredients, and whether the people serving food and drinks had access to recipe cards that weren't designed for normal culinary purposes. When I eventually moved house and donated books to charity shops, I made sure to flip through every cookbook and recipe collection first, checking for handwritten cards that might contain instructions for activities that had nothing to do with legitimate cooking. The lecture notes on the USB stick I discovered in the university library weren't from any course I'd ever heard of. I was hunting for a power socket in the back corner of the university library when I spotted it plugged into an outlet behind one of the desks. Someone had obviously been charging it and forgotten to take it with them when they left. Happens all the time. Students are constantly losing phones, chargers, and memory sticks around campus. I unplugged it thinking I'd hand it in at the front desk, but curiosity got the better of me first. The stick was unlabeled and looked fairly new, so I figured I'd have a quick look to see if there were any files that might help identify the owner. Maybe a name in a document or assignment header that would let me return it directly. When I plugged it into my laptop, the drive contained several folders organized by what appeared to be academic subjects: psychology, sociology, medicine, standard university course materials. But when I opened the psychology folder, the content wasn't anything I recognized from the curriculum. The files were lecture notes and research papers, but the topics were disturbing. Documents about psychological manipulation techniques, studies on breaking down mental resistance, even what appeared to be instruction manuals for inducing specific types of trauma responses in test subjects. I assumed it must be postgraduate research materials, maybe someone studying forensic psychology or criminal behavior analysis. Dark topics, but legitimate academic subjects that would require understanding how psychological harm was inflicted in order to treat or prevent it. But as I looked through more files, the content became increasingly practical and detailed. Not theoretical analysis of psychological manipulation, but step-by-step guides for actually implementing these techniques against real people. The sociology folder contains similar material focused on social isolation tactics, methods for cutting people off from support systems, and strategies for making individuals dependent on specific handlers or controllers. Again, presented in academic language, but with practical applications that seemed designed for actual use rather than theoretical study. Most disturbing was the medicine folder, which contained detailed information about pharmaceutical compounds that could be administered without detection, dosage calculations for different body weights, and instructions for recognizing and managing various types of drug-induced behavioral changes. The documents were professionally written and extensively referenced, but they read more like training manuals for criminal activities than legitimate academic research. Someone had compiled comprehensive guides for psychological manipulation, social control, and chemical incapacitation disguised as university study materials. I started checking the file properties and metadata to understand more about where these documents had come from and who might have created them. Most showed creation dates within the past few months, and several contained revision histories suggesting they were actively maintained and updated. But there were no identifying details about the author or institution. The files were carefully sanitized to remove any information that might trace them back to specific individuals or organizations. When I tried to research some of the reference studies and publications mentioned in the documents, I found that while many were real academic papers, they were being cited in ways that distorted their original findings and conclusions. Legitimate research about trauma recovery was being misrepresented to support techniques for inflicting psychological damage. Medical studies about pharmaceutical effects were being reframed as instructions for drugging people without consent. Academic work was being systematically corrupted to create guides for criminal activity. The USB drive wasn't just study material someone had forgotten. It was a comprehensive training curriculum for people learning to manipulate, control, and harm others using supposedly scientific methods. But I had no idea whether the person who'd lost it was a student researching these topics for legitimate academic purposes, or someone actively involved in activities that required this type of specialized knowledge. The location where I'd found the drive didn't provide any obvious clues. That section of the library was used by students from multiple departments, and anyone could have been working there and accidentally left the USB stick behind. I considered reporting the find to university security or police, but explaining the content would require admitting that I'd accessed files that might be evidence of criminal activity, without knowing whether the materials were connected to ongoing crimes or just disturbing academic research. Reporting them might create problems for innocent people while failing to prevent actual harm. but keeping the drive felt equally problematic. If the materials were being used to plan or commit serious crimes against real victims, failing to report them might mean allowing preventable harm to continue. I decided to research whether similar training materials were available through other sources, hoping to understand whether this was an isolated collection or part of a larger pattern of criminal instruction sharing. That research led me to hidden websites that specialized in providing exactly these types of educational resources. Comprehensive training programs for people who wanted to learn psychological manipulation, social control, and chemical incapacitation techniques. The materials on the USB drive weren't unique. They were part of systematic educational offerings designed to train people in methods for harming others while avoiding detection or accountability. The courses were professionally structured and extensively detailed, covering everything from basic psychological pressure tactics to advanced pharmaceutical manipulation. Students could progress through different skill levels, receive updated materials, and even access practical training opportunities. Most disturbing was that the program specifically targeted university students and recent graduates, recruiting people who had academic backgrounds that would make them effective at applying psychological and medical knowledge for criminal purposes. The training wasn't just theoretical. It included practical assignments where students were expected to test techniques on real people and report back on the effectiveness of different approaches. I realized that whoever had lost the USB drive was probably participating in an organized criminal training program that was systematically teaching people to harm others using supposedly scientific methods. But the educational materials were just one part of a larger operation that included practical application opportunities. Students who completed the training programs were connected with people who could provide targets for practicing their newly acquired skills. The psychological manipulation, social control, and chemical incapacitation techniques weren't being taught for academic interest. They were professional development for people planning to participate in serious crimes against vulnerable victims. The university environment provided perfect cover for this type of criminal education. Students regularly accessed disturbing academic content, participated in psychological research, and studied medical topics that would seem suspicious in other contexts. People learning to manipulate and harm others could blend seamlessly into legitimate academic communities while developing skills that would eventually be used against innocent people who had no idea they were being systematically targeted. But identifying specific participants in these training programs would be nearly impossible without inside knowledge of the recruitment and education processes. The materials were designed to be shared discreetly among trusted individuals who had demonstrated commitment to the criminal applications. Meanwhile, the training programs were probably continuing to recruit new students and develop increasingly sophisticated methods for psychological manipulation, social control, and chemical incapacitation that could be used against growing numbers of victims. The USB drive I'd found was evidence of systematic criminal education that was almost certainly being used to facilitate ongoing harm against people who had no idea they were being targeted by individuals with specialized training in exploitation techniques. But proving the connection between the educational materials and specific crimes would require much more comprehensive investigation than I could undertake safely on my own. I never returned the USB drive to the library or attempted to identify its owner. Instead, I destroyed it and tried to forget about the disturbing training materials I'd discovered. But the knowledge that such comprehensive criminal education was being conducted through apparently legitimate academic channels made me constantly aware of how vulnerable everyone was to manipulation by people who had learned to weaponize psychological and medical knowledge against unsuspecting victims. The week after I destroyed the drive, I noticed someone had been asking around the library about a lost USB stick, providing descriptions that matched exactly what I'd found and offering a substantial reward for its return.